Yeah. So before we throw all modern art out, right? Like I used to make fun of Mondrian, right, for those squares, and then I realized they were oil paints, right? So there is a skill in getting those perfect shapes in oil paints. Now I'm not sure I'd hang it on my wall, but like maybe, a set of coasters. Everything sort of has its place, right? But I have seen the urinal, and it was an interesting experience going to the Modern Art Museum because everybody was just talking all the time, right? And until I got to the room with Monet's water lilies, and everybody shut up, right? Because one, I didn't realize those things are like 10 feet tall. They're huge canvases. Even I was, literally dumbstruck, right? Just looking at these things. But they didn't require an explanation, right? Nobody like looks at the urinal and is like, why is this here? Everybody looks at the urinal and says, why is this here? Nobody looks at Monet's water lilies, right? And wonders. And that was something that really struck me when I was on that trip, because I was a little fed up most of the time because I'd elected to go there instead of the Met, my first trip to New York, because Van Gogh was there and I wanted to see. I have a strong attachment to Van Gogh's paintings, and so I did that. But the rest of the museum kind of let me down until I got to the Monet stuff. And he's of course sort of in the same vein. Um, and so we have this idea that like the artist is like commentator or like legislator, or even as like medium, like the artist is supposed to, which is sort of like two extremes, right? Like on the one hand, you've got this like very like materialist, like the artist is here to create propaganda of one variety or another, and to promote whatever social cause, right? And you see a lot of this in like film criticism. People are like, oh, this movie advances X or Y, like or these characters in this movie represent A or B. And on the other hand, you've got this idea of the artist is like spiritual medium, and people kind of treat science fiction writers like this. I found at conventions, which I always find a little unsettling, where everybody's like, where are you getting your ideas? Like they're sort of like being, handed to them by some, ghost via like
By the quiet.
shamanic magic or something. Yeah, exactly. Or, that they're channeling some religious experience. And maybe some writers are. I'm not convinced that most of them are, certainly not most like science fiction writers, but these are weird because it's usually the same people that have these two attitudes, um, and I don't really hold with either of them. That's not to discount things like actual inspiration in like the literal Greek sense of the word, being breathed into by some higher power, but most people I don't think that's most artists' experience, and I don't know that that's mine either. I think that for most of at least English history, we regarded writers as craftsmen, right? As you say, and they're people who we're not really any different than wheelwrights or masons or plasterers. And you would hire a writer to do a play, right? Shakespeare was on the king's contract or the Lord Chamberlain's or whoever, to produce this artwork, right? And they were people who studied the skill of playwriting or poetry, or usually both, or basic rhetoric to do what they needed to do. And it's just weird that we simultaneously have like turned the artist into a politician and a priest, and it's not the right place. I think that when anybody sort of tries to put themselves in the wrong station, that they are making a sort of almost moral mistake, right? I think that if the artist starts acting like a politician and telling somebody how to behave, they're essentially like usurping power. Like I just don't think that's the right way to be. I don't think my characters like represent anything, right? Like they are themselves. There's that bit in the Lord of the Rings forward where Tolkien denounces allegory.
That's I was just gonna say that.
Yeah, where he denounces allegory, and he says he prefers history, right? Real or feigned. And that's all that I think my stories are. I think that they are feigned histories. And self-consciously so, right? Like, the books are written like a memoir, right? From a time that's not going to exist, by a person who will never be alive, right? But it's not supposed to be a commentary on today. Hadrian isn't representing a set of ideas, in the political theater now, right? He's just, speaking, his to his time, right, which is not a real time. And to the extent that my work or anybody's work is relevant, it's relevant in a universal sense, right? That these are things that are sort of true in all places for all peoples in all time, or at least for all peoples or all cultures in like a certain kind of limited space, right? Like maybe my work's not really relevant to Mesopotamians of like the 3500s BC, but maybe there are a couple little pieces in there they might recognize, if only the Gilgamesh references, right? But yeah, they only are really relevant in terms of applicability, which is something Tolkien also talks about in that same essay. Like, it's not my job to tell people how to think, but if they see something that I've said that it applies to their experience, that's great, but that wasn't necessarily me trying to legislate or to preach at them. Again, to return to those two poles.
But you're right. When you go to a museum like that and you're standing around the urinal, people make these arguments that are kind of self-referential and tautological about, oh, well, I don't really understand this, but everyone's talking about it and we're here standing here staring at it, so there must be something to it.
Yeah, you want to talk about the emperor not having clothes, right?
That's right.
It's exactly that museum exhibit. Like, everybody has to explain, oh no, don't you see the brocade, right? And the you see the cape there? And no, it's just a dumb urinal that's upside down on this podium, right? Like, there's nothing clever here. Why did you all pay to see it? I just am frustrated by art like that. It's a good thing that's not the only thing in the museum, or my ticket would have been wasted, but I'd have paid 5 times that to see Monet. But because it's exactly the same thing, right? If you go, and people don't like it when you point out that the things that they like are stupid, right? Because it's hurting. Especially if they made it a part of their identity. I talked about this in another interview I just did a little while ago, where like people will take, like, if you say you didn't like a new Star Wars film, right? Because I didn't like the new Boba Fett show very much, right? And if you say that you thought that show was bad, people will take that very personally because they made Star Wars a part of them. So if they've internalized the emperor not wearing clothes as part of their identity, then they realize that they're also not wearing the same. They're wearing the same not clothes, right? And that. And that I think gets to them. That's not to say that I think that necessarily my work is better than Star Wars. It's not really my call. I hope that I'm a better craftsman than anybody. I want to be the very best I can be, but that's really something that's up to my readers to, I think, find out for themselves. And I think that if there's a measure of objective quality, it's in staying power. And I really hope that people will still be reading the books after I'm gone. And so I don't know, that I can ever know how good exactly I am at my job, because it'll be something that only will be understandable or knowable after the fact, if that makes sense. Because I think it's easy to fall into the trap of just criticizing other things. Right now, it's very easy to criticize Duchamp because what the hell. But that's sort of low-hanging fruit. In general, it gets harder, when you try to pick apart, like, well, clearly, like I think a lot of superhero movies are dumb, but it clearly means something to a lot of people. Right. And so I'm very hesitant to like throw out every comic book movie ever, even though a lot of them I think are silly. Like, oh, he talks to fish. Okay. But yeah, I want to be careful not to be too critical. That's something I worry about.
Probably that can poison your art a little bit. And and I like the point you make too about identity, that once you make something a part of your identity, what is it Jonathan Haidt says, once you make something sacred, you can't reason about it. So I guess be careful what you make sacred, right? It reminds me of scientists who cling on to their disproven theory even after it's been disproven, just because their whole identity is bound up in being the person who came up with that theory, or the Star Wars person who goes in there and knows that they're watching a bad movie. or an uninspired, lazy movie, or
right. But at least there was a lightsaber, right? And it's like frozen up, like nerd culture's ability to talk about anything, because we don't have the conversations we used to have anymore about like whether or not X is like a better story than Y, because if inevitably someone will take it too personally, and rather than offend, or rather even than have a conversation about it. I can't tell you the last time that like I actually heard a conversation like that walking around a science fiction convention, right? Like the panels now are all just like sort of abstract like conversations about like what is this subgenre or something. It's not like
right.
like who are the good writers, or like which books still matter. There's some sort of like stuff that's baked in, like everybody kind of agrees that like Asimov is important, but like people don't argue, like nerds don't argue the way that nerds did when I was a kid, and it's a very strange thing. But like the whole field feels very paralyzed by
Yeah.
by this exact phenomenon, because you can't like destroy the person you're talking to. There's this sense that like oh, just let people like things, but I think we need to let people not like things. Well, it's also, I mean, the whole idea of being in school falls apart, right? You can't actually know anything if the whole ability to know anything falls apart, because you have to make judgments to operate in the world. You just can't. And this idea that like we can all just completely disagree and have nothing in common is unworkable for one, but it's also impossible, because again, everybody was silent looking at the Monet paintings. Everybody knows those were good paintings. You don't have to explain it, right? Great art doesn't, like, it defies critics. It doesn't to even criticize. You can't look at a Michelangelo and say, well, is it really art? No, it just is. And everybody knows that. And anybody who says it's not is clearly obtuse, and people will tell them that they're being obtuse. Right.
That's right.
Of course, there are people for whom that like actual works of high culture and art are only interesting as like assets to trade. Right. Because some people just have an abacus where their heart should be. And that's like, we need those people too. They have a place in civilization.
We need the mentats.
Yeah, we do. Exactly. But like people who are deliberately like, oh, the urinal is just as good as Monet, right? Are fooling themselves and trying to fool everybody else. But usually people aren't fooled. And you can see this if you just talk to normal people, right? Like nobody gets the urinal. The only people, like, you have to get a degree to understand the urinal. And at that point, what you have isn't a degree. What you have is years and years of programming,
layers of obfuscation, right?
In order to appear smart. But what you're actually doing is buying into this like court of Versailles, like speech code, basically. Like, oh, like the trendy thing to really impress Louis the 14th is to like this urinal, right? And to say X, Y, and Z about the urinal so that I will appear fancy, and then I will qualify for my powdered wig and my mercury, face paint. And then we can eat bonbons and be told when we're allowed to pee, right? And like all it is competing for like this weird absolutist monarch whose attention, and this guy doesn't exist, right? It's just the culture's attention. And if we follow all of these rules, if we buy into the urinal, if we buy into The Last Jedi, which is the urinal of Star Wars movies, or whatever, right? Then we'll be allowed, in polite company and all of these things. And to that I say no thanks, right? Because I don't want to wear the mercury face paint and the powder anyway. It sounds lethal and stuffy. So
I showed my fantasy and sci-fi class this clip of George R.R. Martin talking to Stephen King. The video's been viewed, like a million times. And George R.R. Martin says at one point that he loves Tolkien, obviously, that, but he finds Tolkien to be morally simplistic. And he says that Tolkien externalizes evil by placing evil in, Mordor, and placing all evil in Sauron, that's morally simplistic or something like that. And I just think that ignores basically the entire story. It ignores Boromir.
Well, of course, right? It ignores all the internalized evil.
It
right?
ignores
Gollum. It ignores Wormtongue. It ignores Denethor. It ignores Boromir, right? And some of those characters aren't even, like, Boromir is not bad, right? He just has a bad day, right? Like, it completely brushes aside all of the moral complexity that's in the Lord of the Rings. You know, it's such a frustrating take. And I think, isn't that the same point where he follows up with like, you know, we don't know about like Aragorn's tax plan. I think it's the same speech, and like that is not also something fantastic about taxes, man. Like I don't want the Gondor small council meeting, right? Like, it's just something about that attitude baffles me. There's an interesting point though, right? Like within the cast of Game of Thrones, right? Because you're right. The Starks are fighting for something that matters, and it does matter, right? Because especially as they get scattered, right? The kids want to go home, right? And that home is effectively gone by the end, right? And and this is one of the things that frustrates me about that series, because I love the first three books, and I know it's become popular to dislike the last two because of the way they got split, but which I have a lot of sympathy for. Having a books 4 and 5 that are also split, but that home is gone, right? And they like, and there is still a story to tell about rebuilding it or reclaiming it, and maybe that is where the books are going, but it feels to me like that sort of like the Shire of the Stark children is totally gone in a way that Frodo's Shire was only partially destroyed, right? And maybe it's wrong to pass sentence on the books because they're not done, right? But if the ending is the ending in the show, right, which nobody likes, um, then I do wonder, right, if there's anything left in Westeros, because I often with like sequels, right, like when a story is over, one of the markings of a good ending for me is if I wish there were more stories when there aren't, right? And I don't feel that way where the show has left us, which is not the fault of the author, right? And so I don't know about that, but there was a thing I wanted to say though, just in sort of trying to define or distinguish fantasy, which I guess is the same thing, from the rest of literature, right? And Dave, I think I've done my like vampires are real rant to you before, and it's not really a rant. It's very short, but I kind of got laughed off of a panel once at DragonCon for insisting that vampires 100% totally exist. And then everyone laughed at me. I said, well, ladies, you've all dated at least one, right? And then everyone understood, right? Like there's like a level of reality that's like above ours, right? Which I guess is literally super in the sense of the word, meaning above nature, right? Where there are these like sort of platonic categories of things that exist, right? Like vampires exist. Those types of dudes run around, sucking the life out of people. And they're not all the same, but they're all kind of like they kind of like fit into this sort of platonic, archetype, right? Same with like dragons are totally real, right? Especially in prehistoric times, like people got eaten by cats or lit on fire, or they got bitten by snakes, or there was some rich dude who amassed hordes of gold in his castle and he stole virgins, right? Like those people are all acting in like the spirit of a dragon, right? Those phenomena are all acting in that way. And what I think distinguishes fantasy, right? Because what's interesting about fantasy is that it doesn't really exist as a genre like until people start getting less religious, right? Is that it is the form of literature that like engages with that symbolic language, that symbolic layer, literally. Like dragons are literally on the page as dragons. They're not like the dragon in Thomas Harris, right? The serial killer, right? It's literally a dragon. And so there's something that's like really honest, like fundamentally honest about fantasy. Like it's sort of like the redheaded stepchild in academia, right? Like everyone's like, this is silly stuff for kids, right? Which is the same thing that fantasy fans who don't really like Tolkien say about Tolkien, but I digress. Right, but there's something that's just very honest about the fact that this sort of symbolic layer that's like totally real, and we all act like it's real, right? We all are like, oh man, like if you've ever been like around a crime, right, or something like truly evil, like there's something intrinsically supernatural about that experience. It's like, oh shit, like I just touched something that was like way deeper and darker than normal existence. And fantasy puts that on the page in like a substantive way. It's not hidden under a metaphor, right? It's like less metaphorical than literary fiction, right? Than realistic fiction, because it takes those, they're not quite metaphors in real life, and concretizes them. And I think that that fantasy is good when it brings that symbolic world onto the page as it is, right? And I think that maybe some writers are more or less in touch with that kind of way of perceiving reality than others. But I think that to the degree that it does that, it's really great literature. And to the degree that it is a product, that is meant to earn money, then it's just not, right? And that's not to say, right, that like you can't be great literature and earn money, or that you must be poor to be great, right? But I do think there's sort of a, we talked about the the fantasy literature to board games pipeline, right? And how that circles back around. Like, so much modern fantasy is like an 8th generation product, right? That has lost touch with that deeper sort of that deeper mythological, religious, symbolic layer to reality. You don't need to be religious to like understand what I'm talking about. It might help, right? Depending on, and you don't need to, I don't care which religion you are, but it makes, I think, people more sensitive to this sort of way of thinking. Chris Traylor says, we've been talking to Pajo again. I haven't in a while, actually, but Jonathan has been very influential in my way of thinking. But I do feel that way, right? So interesting you say that, because I can't remember why. I was reading newspaper clippings from like the 1920s, and there was one article, I think it was about upheavals in China at the time, right? And the newspaper article was making a bunch of allusions to Homer, and I thought about the, just read another book meme with regard to journalists and Harry Potter, and I was like, oh, they used to, right? And it's just interesting to look, right? Like 100 years ago, you could read a regular old newspaper and find people who would reference, right? Who would reference the Iliad, who would reference the Odyssey, who could tell you every detail of Caractacus's uniform. And people don't know who Caractacus is anymore, right? Like,
no, our intellectuals are citing Hunger Games. They're not citing the decline of the Roman Empire.
Right. Although you shouldn't cite Gibbon, because Gibbon is a
no, I didn't say the decline of fall of the Roman Empire.
I'm just kidding. But yeah, so it's just interesting, because I do think the well hasn't dried up. I think someone's like blocked it. For most people, they don't even know. You could talk to a person on the street and they've never heard of Genghis Khan, right? Like, which is astonishing to me. I'm like, it's kind of important, right? Like, you never know.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, yes. That the whole thing is, right, is that like evil doesn't actually exist, right? Like it can't make things, right? We're talking, I'm very much, of the party of Tolkien, right, on this issue. And so, yeah, they were basically uplifted by the Watchers. I think I could say that much, right? And so it's not that they haven't been able to sort of, tinker with these things, but we have this sense that like what progress means in 2022 is like technological, right? But if you look even at like historical civilizations, right, the Romans were not really interested. Like, we have this sort of meme that like if the Roman Empire had lasted another 500 years, there would have been an industrial revolution. And culturally, that's just not the case. Like, they were perfectly aware, of, you've got like Hero of Alexandria and steam engines. They didn't see the point. Right. They were really interested in technology insofar as it related to like one or two things, right? Like mining, they were like very capable in certain areas, but they weren't interested in like serious technological innovation, in part because their upper class, right, was like very sort of anti-technology. And you see a vein of that in, because like engineering was like a poor person thing, right? It wasn't, like the sort of upper class of Roman society was interested in art and letters and rhetoric. They weren't interested in engineering. And you see some of that with the Solons, right, for very different reasons. But you see that too with the Cielcin. They basically have a toolkit that they've discovered in part or been handed, perhaps, in other part. But they, they're working with that toolkit. So there's like a little adjustment for like maybe ergonomics, but they're not really like pushing, the envelope. They're not out there developing, their own shields, right? Even the stuff Syriani's taking, right? And there's, there are a lot of, cultural precedents you can point to here on Earth, right, that do that, as I said. But yeah, no, that was very much a deliberate choice because they also biologically probably can't operate a technologically, a proficient civilization, right? They actually, kill each other to get ahead, right? Like as a matter of course, some humans do, right? But like, it's not actually like you get social theorists and stuff will say that that's what humanity is. Like, it's not what humanity is, right? Humanity is mostly pretty cooperative. We are a little bit closer to bonobos than chimps, societally, right? And Cielcin are a lot closer to chimps, let's just say. In terms of how they behave, and so they couldn't like run a research institute, and so like the question is, like how did they get all this stuff if they can't do that? And you have to find a practical world building solution to explain that, right? And that is uplifting, right? So yeah. So to I guess do that in reverse, right? There's this really shitty old Tumblr post that goes around that's like, you do realize as a human being, you're a ghost piloting a meat robot that's got like that's got like bits of exposed bone, and isn't that metal? And I'm like, that is not what a person is, right? Like you can't actually separate those two things, right? There's this, and I'm gonna go into philosophy space, so Mike, don't shoot me. There's this Aristotelian concept of hylomorphism, right, where like the sort of Platonic form doesn't really exist, right, unless it is embodied in some way, right? It's like what a person is an incarnate soul, right? You're basically the conversation between flesh and spirit, right? You could see how like this might be very appealing to like Christian theology or something, right? But like you can't actually like cut the soul out of a person, right? And this is something that I've talked about a lot in like Howling Dark in particular with like body modification and machinery and things like that. Because if you damage or alter your brain in certain ways, right, you will alter your personality, right? And now you can either go one of two ways with that. You can be a pure materialist and say, well, I messed with your brain and I destroyed who you are, right? Or you can say that, who you were, right, it doesn't exist anymore because you've altered that conversation, right? You've disrupted it in some way. But the Cielcin don't feel that way. They very much feel that the world is a simulation, basically, and because this is what's so funny about the like we're living in a video game thing that like Elon Musk talks about, is it's also Gnosticism, right? It is also this idea that like everything is fake and we're in the Matrix, right? The Matrix is also like very subconsciously Gnostic, those movies, and nothing is real. And what you end up when you start thinking that way is you basically like you're on the slippery slope that ends with like shooting up a shopping mall, right? Because like you just kind of you end up like Mephistopheles and Faust, like hating existence itself, because it's like like by its very nature, reality becomes this like prison that you're trapped in, right? And that's why it was considered heresy in the ancient world, Gnosticism, yes. And it verges too on things like Manichaeism as well, right? The Manichaeans like had issues with the idea of food, right? Because like food was this thing that like kind of like kept you plugged into the material world, and like it's a very strange way of thinking about things. And so that was all stuff I wanted to pull on with the Cielcin as well, because I am in like making up aliens. I'm a lot more interested in biology and culture than I am in like what kind of weird ray gun do they have. I'm not, you know, I have a couple sci-fi writer friends, right? Like David Weber, right? Who I will have this argument of all the time, right? Because he's so interested in like weapon systems and stuff like that. That stuff's really cool. It is not my forte, right? You know, I would much rather like, what do they think about, you know, existence, and how is that informed by like where they are in the food chain, right? And because a lot of stuff, you know, a lot of our ideas are, you know, the consequence of our embodiment, right? Because you get this with robots too, right? Like there's a thing in cybernetics called the frame problem. And robots, like we had a really hard time getting machines to distinguish objects from background in photographs. We thought it'd be easy. We like, there is a cup, right? They couldn't do it until we started.
No, they couldn't do it because it's a functional problem. Human beings perceive the world in terms of functionality.
Oh, so utility, right? And so
yeah.
when we start giving them implements for interacting with the world, they're able to actually start seeing this. Because what you don't see is a cup. What you see is thing I can grab that holds things.
Exactly.
And your brain is responding to utility, right? It's not responding to just the actual material stuff. So we kind of
like photos of boats to prove I'm not a robot.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's actually exactly it. That's how the captchas work, right? Because they can't do that. Then like they'll get better at it, right? Like we can probably improve, you know, machine learning intelligence, things like that. But it is something that we're a lot better at than for the moment than machines are. And so and that's because we're responding to this sort of idea, like people make fun of Plato, right? Because he's like, oh, there's like a magical world where like there's a perfect chair, dude, or like a perfect triangle. Like, what are you talking about? It's crazy, right? But there is like a like idea of a cup in everybody's head individually, and it's broadly the same. And we all kind of respond to the cup the same way. So what we're responding to is like the idea of the cup that's like incarnate basically in the actual cup that you see, right? So like there's an idea of cups that's in all cup-like things. And this is true of people, right? And so like a lot of Hadrian's philosophical argument with the extrasolarians or the Cielcin is about this, right? Because the extrasolarians are, everything is meat, right? There is no spirit, right? We can do whatever we want to ourselves, to you, none of it matters, right? And the Cielcin kind of arrive at the same basic conclusion, but because they're going the opposite direction, right? They're like, none of this matters because there is a spiritual world that we can never really affect, and we need to get to that. So we need to sort of, you know, destroy everything. Yeah, I think so. And that's, I mean, that's who he is, right? Like he has this very old school classical education. And one of the things that's fun about Syriani and Hadrian, right, is they're like, they could be friends if like one of them wasn't a Cielcin, right? And like, and that sounds bad, right? Because like
Syriani might say they could be friends if one of them wasn't a human. So
it's also true, right? Exactly. But like, there's like this, like, there are a couple moments in there where it's like we are almost friends, right? There's almost a Batman Joker thing going on there. And I wanted to do that because I didn't want to do the like big dumb alien warlord thing. Like he's kind of a nerd, right? You know, he's like, look at all these ancient ruins and like, let me talk about the like protracted lineages of all of our clans and all of this stuff. And Hadrian, like in a vacuum, would like nothing more than to talk about exactly that stuff. Of course, it's not a vacuum, and he's had a lot of his skin peeled off, and you know, like everything is very, you know, terrible. Fantasy and science fiction, I think, concretize this sort of symbolic layer of how we relate to reality, how consciousness relates to reality, and makes it real in the narrative in a way that, like, the dragon in Red Dragon by Thomas Harris is just a guy, right? Like, he's a dragon, but because he acts like one, but it's cooler if he was really a dragon and like ate a village, right? Instead of was just a serial killer. Not that Red Dragon is lame; it's in fact very good, but I like science fiction and fantasy because in a sense they feel closer to that sort of like reality of experience. Like we all feel like our challenges are hordes of goblins and dragons and impregnable fortresses and stuff. And I think fantasy especially appeals to people more so than science fiction, because that's a world we all sort of recognize symbolically in a deeper, more felt sense than science fiction. Because science fiction is like one,
guys or ladies' abstract vision of what the future might be like, and that's like a way more nebulous thing than knights and castles, right? And I largely think that's why fantasy is an edge. It's a lot easier for people to imagine, medieval Europe, but with magic, right? Or, medieval India or whatever. Or, that there is magic in modern day Chicago or what have you, than it is to sort of, picture whatever goofy alien I've made up. But I that was sort of a very big answer in like lots of little parts, but I think I'll just.
Well, you said, Christopher, you've said in the past that, you've said that fantasy is in some sense more real than reality. Yeah. It's meta real. Why don't you go into that a little bit? What do you mean
it's
by
like
that?
I was saying with the dragons, right? Like, I do think that dragons exist, right? I think that Santa Claus exists. This is an idea. There's a Christian artist called Jonathan Pageau talks about. He makes icons for churches. He's an Orthodox guy. And he has this whole spiel about how Santa Claus is real because once a year your parents pretend to be him, right? And so the idea of Santa Claus, the spirit of Santa Claus, exists in something that's more than a metaphorical sense, right? Because like Santa Claus's actions are happening, right? Like gifts are appearing under the Christmas tree. And like that is real, right? And the thing that your parents as a kid are participating in when they pretend to be Santa Claus and they keep the story going is real, right? The same way that that guy you dated is a vampire, right? You did invite him into your life and he did suck the blood out of you, right? Like that did happen for real, right? It's not exactly a metaphor. It's a little bit stronger than that. Yeah, I'm sorry, John. It's Santa's not exactly real. He's not real the way that this desk is. But I do think in that same sense, I think Middle Earth is real in a way that some sort of bloodless, modernist novel about sad people, in Washington D.C. is not real, right? It's like I have a lot more in common with Bilbo Baggins than I do like someone in California in a lot of ways, I think. I'm picking on California for some reason, but I think that we can relate to those experiences in a way because I think that way of looking at the world is more normal to us than the scientific method, if that makes sense. And so I think that is where the appeal of fantasy comes from, it sort of underneath that layer of adventure or escape, right? It's an adventure to or an escape to a world where that way of looking at the world is solid, right, and not analogical. And so I think that's where a lot of the appeal lies. But I also think that appeal manifests in a lot of different ways. I think for a lot of people, like Christopher, that's like way too abstract and goofy. If they don't agree with me, right? I just think it's cool. That's the same thing, actually, because coolness, thinking something is cool, is a measure of your relation to something and your engagement with it, right? Which is what I'm talking about. So, I see no point in reading sort of realistic fiction because it's actually faker. It's still participating in it's participating in an additional level of illusion, right? To pretend that all there is the world of atoms and objects that we pretend we live in, and I don't think we do. So it's funny you mentioned that because I just watched Twin Peaks, right? Which famously people don't like season 2 because it kind of literally loses the plot in the back half. I didn't even notice. I was just having such a lovely time, and then it really comes back together there at the end. Whereas the third season, which was made in 2017, was just sort of, it was weird. It was both like relentlessly sort of breakneck, laser focused on the plot. And then David Lynch likes to just take, 10 minutes to make you watch a guy sweep a floor, which I think is hilarious. It was painful. And like, I was totally like, I'm going to check my phone. But what if something important happens? I don't know, and I think part of the point of that was to make you think about that part of you, right? Not, watching the show correctly. But it was nice. And I love, like, I think we talked about this last time. I love Stargate, right? Which has 20 episode seasons, and you don't have that anymore. And now, is it the case that like, you just want to tell the core story of SG-1 that you need all of those episodes? Of course not. Right. But like, if you did just do like a 10 episode season version that maybe SG-1's 5 seasons, and you like just do the like main focused gold plot, right? You lose all this time with Carter and Daniel and Teal'c and O'Neill and and the rest, Mitchell and Zala, and the time with those characters is really what makes the show special, right? Now, I don't know that you necessarily need everything to be like that, because we were also just declaiming the virtues of shorter books, right? But there is something to be said about that space for something to breathe, right? And there is something to be said about even like not so tightly written longer books in the same way. It comes back to execution, right? And if the writer is skilled enough to make a walk through the forest interesting, then it's worth reading. And I've like never resonated with that critique of Tolkien, right? It's like, oh, he talks about the trees so much, right? Yes, because they're all going to get chopped down by Saruman by the end, and you're going to be sad about it. Damn it, right? And like nobody thinks the ending is bad that I'm aware of, right? And like to make the ending work, you need to appreciate all of the trees. Otherwise, it's not sad, because none of the hobbits are murdered when they get home. It's not that there's old Odo Proudfoot's head is on a pike. All right, it's just that they came and built a damn new mill, and William Blake and Tolkien are sad about it. That was for you, Jordan. But
I might have to clip that. That was so funny. That was a great Christopher Ruocchio like banger, all-time great quote.
But I do think that a smaller, tighter, more precise novel is more impressive. Someone said in the comments it sounded like you've been bitten by Gene Wolfe, and like I said this in we were talking about Shadow of the Torturer a couple weeks ago on Talking Story. Those books basically have like no wasted words at all. Like they are so precise, right? It's like reading a Rolex. It's just everything is just exactly where it needs to be and works in exactly the right timing and meter with everything. It's just great, right? And that is substantially harder than just writing 500,000 words, right? Whatever those 500,000 words may be. They might be great 500,000 words, but to achieve Book of the New Sun, for example, right, is an achievement, right, all its own, and of a different kind. But for me, to circle back to the original question, right, I started reading science fiction and fantasy for a very different reason than I continue to, because obviously my relationship with the genre, but the art form itself, right, literature, has changed because it's my job now. And to a certain extent, that means that reading has become more onerous because it tastes like work, which means that I have to approach it differently, which means and this extends to like other media, right? I've been watching, I watched Andor, for example, and like, I'm just like, oh, that was pretty great. But like, what if they had done, something differently, right? Mostly I think it was pretty good, for anyone in the comments asks. I have some qualms with it, but not important. What's important is that when I started, we talk about escape. I never liked the word escape growing up, and I still don't, because there's sort of a pejorative angle to it, connotation to it, where like, oh, like you're reading escapist literature, right? What, you like having fun? But there's sort of a sneer that either academics or your mom might express. Less so now. Being a geek is a lot more acceptable than it was when I was a kid. My parents were supportive of reading, but like, you know what I mean? Like maybe Jordan, you may remember this better too. That you're a little older than me. That people were a little bit more snide about science fiction and fantasy than they are now. There was always this sort of like, that's not real, right? That's silly, right? Sort of thing to it. But I thought rather than escape, I wanted an adventure, right? I am still Bilbo Baggins. I felt a lot like Bilbo Baggins as a kid. It wasn't that I needed to get out of where I was. My life was pretty good. My parents were wonderful. My family life was good. But like, if I could go fight Mordor or Darth Vader or whatever, that would be great. And then I could come home, right? I could go steal some treasure from a dragon and then come back, and that would be great. I would be home again, and there would be treasure, right? That would be even better than never having left or escaping, right? And so I read for adventure, and less so now, because what I found is, as I've written more, as I've been a writer just sort of in the culture of writing more, I have become less enchanted of a lot of literature, particularly like a lot of stuff that's made now, because we just are producing art at a rate that is not in keeping with, I think, humanity's ability to produce artists. Well, I'll say no more about that. But I do think that a lot of stuff has just sort of left me kind of cold. And so I had to think about like what it is I really, really like about science fiction and fantasy, because so much of it falls flat for me. And now it's way less about the escape or about the adventure, right, than it is about what the art is saying. And if what the art is saying is interesting, or even better, if it's true, right, in that sense that fiction is true, right, even when there's a dragon, right, what does the dragon mean? And is that talking about something that's real, right? There are threats that feel like dragons, right, in real life. And so reading a story about slaying one is about that challenge, whatever that challenge is. Yeah, for me, the thing that gets me, period, is good writing itself, right? If someone is a good writer, this is the thing. I obviously, so like there's a little bit of a bugbear here in that my most persistent strain of criticism is that I am derivative, right? And I do not understand the fetish for originality at all. I don't get it, because like a lot of novel ideas don't work. An upside down toilet is useless, right? And in fact dangerous to your health and cleanliness. Health and hygiene. Let me edit that. That's some alliteration. Whereas ideas like narrative tropes work because they work, and they work because they have worked. And now there are things you can see too many times, but I get very frustrated when people are like, "Oh, that's a trope." Like, yeah, of course it is, right? For most of like literary history, characters were archetypes, right? Most comedy forever, and it still kind of is tropic. Characters literally were masks with class names, right? Harlequin, Columbina, Puccinella, right? You didn't know what the story was, but you knew what that character did every time you see him, right? And so writers would just iterate on those sort of molds, right? They might change the character's name, but you could recognize, like, oh, that's Scaramouche, right? Like, I know what he's going to be like, right? Even though his name is not that, right? And you think about the telling and retelling of like King Arthur stories, right? People expect, Galahad to act in a certain way, Lancelot to act in another. And when they don't act like that, it sucks, actually. And you see this in like modern retellings that ruin things because people want to turn the toilet upside down. But the thing that transcends that is craft, right? And so if a writer is a good writer, it doesn't matter if the story is one that you have seen before, because what you should be experiencing is the story, right? I had a guy on Instagram, Yusuf, if you see this, great question, right? Is like, why do I like give the ending away, to Sun Eaters? Because I don't want you to read for what's on the next page. I want you to read the page that you are reading, right? I want you to read the words and like read the story. I want you to watch the movie. I don't want you to wait for the post-credits scene so you can see what the next movie is. Like, be where you are, right? Read the page that you're on. And people don't do that anymore. They read so they have something to talk about, not so that they have an experience. They do this. We do this with everything, right? We eat food so we can take pictures of it. Eat the damn food. What's wrong with you? Life is very short. It should not be about impressing other people. It should be about being where you're at, right? This is the Yoda thing about, never having your mind on where you are, right? And I'm bad at this too. Like, I have next books to plan. That's annoying, right? I just want to write this one and for it to feel like an accomplishment. But
it's always a surreal moment, Christopher, when you're at a concert and you're seeing this legendary band before you and you're standing there enjoying it, and you're marveling at how surreal it is that you're 10 feet away from this legendary band that is connected to so many nostalgic moments that you've experienced, and loves and heartbreaks and all these things. And you look around and everyone is watching it through a screen.
Right.
And you think to yourself, why would you separate yourself like that?
For just 1 second, right? Or, nature intervenes, you have to go to the bathroom. That's annoying, right? You just can't be present, right? It's, and so I wanted really very much to make people read the damn book. And so I wanted to take at least some of the tension of what's going to happen on the next page away from you, so that you would look at something else. And so it's annoying when people give the books bad marks for that, right? Or for the derivative thing. That's annoying for different reasons. But when they're like, "Ooh, I already know the ending." No, you don't actually, right? Because what you have not done is read anything. You think you know some things, right? But you haven't read the book yet. And so what I look for is writing that's good, because if the writing is captivating in itself, it's worth reading, even if I know, that King Arthur dies at Camlan at the hands of Mordred. I don't care, right? If it's a good version of that, it's worth seeing, right? I don't need to see new scenes. I don't need, Vortigern to have some sort of sea monster with tentacles, right? I was just thinking about the Charlie Hunnam movie, which I actually don't hate, but because the soundtrack is really good. But like, there's so much in there I didn't need. I needed to see the sword get pulled out of the stone, right? I needed to see the things I was expecting.
I don't know about anybody else, but I was super shocked to learn that it's kind of the dregs of the families that are sent to go to this order. So
it's like it's like his version of the Wall.
It's the Wall, yeah.
Kinda, yeah. How widespread is that knowledge? Because it seems like something that would have gotten around to.
You're the smart one. You go to the Scholiasts. Yeah. That's
it's sort of like Ivy League schools, right? Like, everybody knows that most of the people who go there, right? Of the people who go there, there are two kinds of people, right? There are the people who really deserve to be there, and then there are the people who got in through one, either money or some sort of,
about who you know,
enrollment policy.
Sure.
And so, like, a lot of people know that most scholiasts are like not that great, right? But that's a good way to sort of defang your, extra child, right? Or to, like, get some political leverage out of them, right? Most people who have advanced degrees are not, like, really going to do cutting edge blue sky research, right? And so that's true with a lot of the scholiasts. And everybody kind of knows that, right? But it's not the case that every scholiast is useless. Right?
Gotcha. Okay.
There are still plenty of them that, like, really know what they're about, right? Or at the very least, could serve Lord as like a good accountant, right?
Mm-hmm.
And can do the memorizing and stuff like that. But yeah. I kept telling people, like, they're not mentats. They're not. Right. They're really not. Actually. It takes a lot of. There's no trick. There's no Sappho juice. It's like, you actually have to be good at this. And most people, even with the sort of Palatine advantages, aren't really good enough to do the sort of research that would need to be done, because everything they do is theoretical, right? They're not allowed to, like, really do hands-on work unless they're being watched by the chantry or, like, the military or something. So so the ones that are good enough to, like, improve warp drives, right, or something, right, are fairly few. But the ones that are qualified to, like, teach some other noble families' kids, rhetoric, like, that's like Gibson's obviously not stupid, right?
Sure.
But is he like is he a Isaac Newton? Like, nah, right? And that tends to be more the case. It's just not the case that they are human computers, despite that being their sort of mythological reputation sometimes, right? But yeah, so it's not like everybody kind of knows, but it's also, like, not that big a deal, if that makes sense.
It felt like it hit Hadrian pretty hard, so I was just curious.
Yeah, well, it's something that he wanted to be that, right?
Right.
And so he had this sense that, like, oh man, that would be really amazing. It's kind of like, it's like, I always wanted to be a science fiction writer, and I thought it'd be really cool to be, like, part of the sort of college of science fiction writers. And then I, like, started going to conventions, and, like, boy, like, I don't get along with them. Like, they're not my class of people, right? They're obviously, there are exceptions, but, like, I don't have fun being on panels and talking about this stuff. Like, I have very different, attitudes. And so I in the same way, you know, that I learned that actually like it's not the way that I wanted it to be. You know, Hadrian learned, oh, the thing I wanted isn't real either. So you know, so that hit him kind of hard for personal reasons. But it also like goes in waves, right? I think in the first book he talks about how Scholiasts are pretty quickly scapegoated, right? Because they're like, you know, witch adjacent, right? Yep. So every now and then people are like, oh, actually they're like spooky good, man. We got to get rid of that guy, drive him out of town. He's causing the problems. So it sort of depends, like the culture kind of like the tendency is to think about, you know, any country, right, as being the same all the time. Right, like America now is the same as America in like 1950 because it's America, right? Like nothing's changed. There's still a White House. There's a Congress. Like it does everything. But like if you look at like Rome is not the same country, even when it's, you know, an empire and an empire, right? Like you know 100 AD Rome is not 300 AD Rome, and the Solid Empire is the same way. Like there are periods where like, you know, they're like way more effective. You know, Hadrian talks about this like last big wave of expansion, right? When they are, you know, building these, you know, tremendous sort of fortresses like the one in Berenice that's like way above what they're capable of sort of doing, you know, in his time, right? And that might come back again, right? It sort of ebbed and flowed a few times, and so sometimes the Scholiasts are really formidable and they're a lot more powerful, sort of a institutional force than they are in Hadrian's day, and you know, by Hadrian's day they're a weaker one, and the Chantry is sort of more ascendant. But those dials are always turning. So
cool.
Speaking of 300 AD Rome, did I catch your reference about Valerian, the Roman emperor?
who got used as a footstool?
That
Yes.
uses a footstool when
Yes.
he's captured by Shapur the First.
Yes, that was.
You guys are
cool.
jumping on me for noticing Greek mythology and listen to that shit. Woo!
No, that was awesome
Like
because
Hadrian on here now.
Hadrian was like, I seem to recall the story of a king of Earth whose conqueror made him act like a footstool.
Yes, that was Shapur and Valerian. No, for sure. I think it was the two of them who called each other son in correspondence, like as a diss. I can't remember, but they would write back and forth and be like, son. It might have been them, but it was some Persian and Roman emperor went back and forth like that. Actually, I think it was later, now that I'm saying that, because there was a period in sort of the Middle Byzantine era where I think around the time like right before the Muslims showed up and sort of de-Persified Persia, when they were kind of friends, so they called each other brother, and then after that broke down, they started calling each other son, and I think that's very funny. So, but everyone knows that that's my period of history, right? So.
Separates us from the animals in a pretty profound sense, and that's a very writer thing to say, right? But scientists will say, well, it's math, right? It's whatever, right? But I think it's storytelling, and I think the essential function of storytelling is pedagogical, right? I think that you tell a story to communicate a point, right? Now that when I say pedagogical, I don't necessarily mean in like an educational sense, although that's certainly the point of some stories. But I think that characters go through a story, right? Whether that's, characters in a novel or characters in an anecdote, right? Like you have a sort of a rhetorical crea, right? You tell a story about like a hypothetical person doing whatever, so that you don't have to, right? They experience something, even hypothetically, so that you don't have to, right? And now that might be purely for entertainment, right? The goal of the story might be for you to experience an emotion. That's still a kind of education in sort of the broadest sense of the term. So it can just be to entertain, but it can also be to instruct, whether that is, to impart like a piece of actual, like concrete knowledge, scientific knowledge, or philosophical knowledge, or whatever, right? It might be to engender an emotional experience. I was thinking about like Orwell's 1984 specifically, right? Which is totally an essay disguised as a novel, right? It is, it is deeply a deeply pedagogical story. But it's more instructive for us to get Orwell's point through Winston's experiences, through Julia's experiences, and through O'Brien, right? Than it is for him to just simply expound his point. Now, I'm not saying that like every novel is someone sitting there, basically with a piece of chalk, like trying to teach you a lesson, right? But like I said, the lesson can take different forms. And I think the basic, and I think that once, if I'm right, right? I think then the question of how narrative works is a sort of secondary question about answering whatever the author's goal is with the story, right? This is sort of my basis for how I think about literary criticism generally, is as a means of evaluating whether or not the author was successful in communicating their vision. Right, there are some books I think that are successful despite the author's intent, or some way, or in some way at right angles with the author's intent, whereas some are directly on message, and the author knows exactly what he or she is doing at all times, and so I think I'm getting away from the point, but I think that it is essentially this pedagogical sort of exercise. It's sort of an abstract kind of way.
Because I had an experience the other day. I was reading Storm of Swords, and I realized I had gotten through probably, and this is speaking of AP's points on dialogue, I had gotten through like 5 chapters in a row. And I said to myself, so much is happening in this book. It's incredible. And then I realized when I closed the book, actually, everyone was just talking the whole time. And not a lot was actually happening. And so that means that George R.R. Martin is a unique writer in the sense that he's able to have just characters talking in a smoky back room, but you feel like so much has happened.
Yeah, I think in Martin's case that might be an artifact of his TV writing, right? Because so much of what you are, what you are writing when you're writing a script is the dialogue, right? Because all the other channels are sort of in the hands of other people to an extent. Now you have to give the director a bit of a framework, but this goes back to what AP was saying about medium, right? And the thing about prose literature that's sort of different from making a comic book or a movie or a television show or a video game or really anything else is that all those channels are kind of in the hands of one person, right? Now you have an editor, but you are playing actually every instrument that's available to you. When I did one Marvel Comics story, right? It was like a 10-page little short, right? But I had to learn how to write comic books for this. And the thing that really, there are a lot of things that are that seemed obvious, right, in retrospect, but I just never thought about. You can't do more than one thing in a panel, right? Because it's a static image. There are limitations of the medium. But there was also a great sense of relief when I realized that most of what I was writing in the script, no one was ever going to see, right? Because it was up to the artist to sort of make that work. So I think that if you're writing, a script generally, that you tend then to think mostly about how the dialogue works and feels and flows and sounds, because all that other stuff is, the director's job, the set director's job, right? The people who are building whatever, and the composer's job, right? Whatever. Now, when you're writing prose, it's all on you, right? So I think in George Martin's case, his ability to do that, or his tendency to do that, depending on your preference, is maybe an artifact of that whole part of his career, but which is interesting because it is amazing how he can do so much with actually just an old lady sitting at a table, right? But as far as the Gnosticism thing goes, one, I just want to say, do we ever get through a conversation without you saying the word Gnosticism, Jordan? I don't think we ever.
No, we don't. But at the same time, I was thinking about how I'm going to use a Catholic term here. You kind of want your fiction to be hylomorphic.
I knew this is where you were going, right? Well, see, here's the thing: is that Aristotle is right, and we are not ghosts piloting meat robots. We are actually embodied persons, right, with an interior life, and those things are completely integrated, body and soul, and are not really intelligible if you try to separate them. And narrative does reflect this. This is something I hadn't thought about exactly until you spelled it out just now. But since you were leading me, I'll take the bait. I think that's right, because I think you can fall into either one of those traps. I think you can only describe exterior action and all this stuff, but there is this additional sort of fourth dimension, right, of interior space that needs to be in prose to a certain degree. Now, the degree to which you need to have that interior life has sort of varied, over the course of literature, right? You read older stuff, and maybe there's more or less of it depending on the period you're talking about, right? Or depending on the medium too. I'm always amazed reading Robert E. Howard at how much happens in a Conan story. Way more happens in a Conan short story than happens in most modern novels, in terms of action. And it's really, really amazing. Actually, in 10,000 words, he can do more than even I can with 300,000 words. In some cases, that might be a slight exaggeration, but the nature of the writing is different structurally. In part because he isn't spending a lot of time in Conan's head. But I don't know that necessarily would make him a materialist. I think that you can address. I don't think that not exploring the interior dimension necessarily makes a writer materialistic, and if only exploring the interior dimension makes you a Gnostic. But because I think there's room for how you go about that. But I think as a heuristic, I think that's an interesting sort of premise. And I personally think that you should have a bit of both. I think that modern readers especially like that interior exploration. I think that's very in at the moment. I think that's one of the reasons why my own stuff has done as well as it has been doing, because it is very about like one person's sort of emotional and spiritual journey, right? But in the context of being a space Roman and fighting robots and monsters and all that stuff, right? Because you got it, right? But there's with the exception maybe of Frodo, there's not a lot of interiority in Tolkien, really, right? But that doesn't mean it's not there. He gets criticized for having pretty flat characters, but I don't think that means they're not interesting. I think that the expectations of modern readers are often mismatched to what the book is. Aragorn is deeply complicated and multifaceted, but he doesn't have growth. He doesn't need to grow. He did it all already, right? And so the fact that we don't have to explore his internal psyche might disappoint modern readers, but it's not like it's not accounted for. It's not like it wasn't thought about. So there are different approaches to how you can turn those dials, and as long as you can find a way to make anything work, there really are very few hard and fast rules for like how those dials need to be set. People tend not to like second person, but like even there you can like make it work under certain circumstances and in certain dosages. But but there are conventions that people expect, right? And you can only betray or abuse your audience so far. They like it a little bit, I found, but you can't just completely defeat their expectation of what a story looks like, because then they won't read it because they don't have to. I actually think we have it easier because if you're writing about Chicago in the 1980s, you run the risk of having readers who lived there, and they're going to know better than you if you didn't, right? This is true. I mean, this is still true in speculative fiction, right? If you're writing about the 12th century, if you're writing about a fantasy world that is loosely equivalent to the 12th century in some way, and it does not actually feel like the 12th century, or you've done something very silly like lit a castle with torches instead of rushlights, or something like that practical, or something a lot more sort of broad ranging, like have everybody speak like a millennial or curse like a millennial. Right, instead of like someone in the 12th century or like someone in a vaguely 12th century-esque culture, right? That will ruin immersion, right, for people who are familiar with what you're supposed to be pulling from. And so whether or not you're writing in a secondary world or not, the onus on you is to try and get these things right, because it doesn't, even in Narnia, it doesn't make sense to use giant torches inside where you're going to maybe at least cover the ceiling in soot, right? Those rules still apply, right? And nothing drives me crazier on this point than when people are like, well, it's just made up, right? It's fine. It's not, though. It's not fine. It has to make sense. There are limits. Unless we're living in a world where like no wood makes soot, you have to look at these things seriously. You can't set your you don't want to set your army on the front of the stakes, Game of Thrones. They need to be behind the stakes. I'm sorry, but the rules of medieval combat are not changed by the fact that Melisandre exists. This is the show's fault. I'm not picking on George, but it makes me very upset. But no, I think we actually have it easier. I think a lot of the pressure is off. One of the reasons that I chose to write so far in the future is that I could do basically whatever I wanted in terms of a lot of the on the ground reality. Because there are things I didn't want to have to worry about too much. like, I don't know, like cybersecurity. I don't know anything about that. I don't want to write about it. So I don't want to write a science fiction universe that like is too computer heavy, because then I would have to, one, do a lot of work that I don't want to do to learn stuff that I don't want to learn. But two, I would be writing a story I didn't want to write, right? And so I think in fantasy and in science fiction, you have a lot more latitude to ignore dimensions of world building that you don't want to invest in than you would if you were writing any sort of period piece or realistic fiction necessarily. I remember I was talking to, I think it was Mike Cole and Michael Livingston at a convention. Michael Livingston is like an actual historian, right? Like he was trying to locate I think he did locate the actual site of the Battle of Crécy, right? And Mike Cole was writing a popular history book, and I can't remember who they were. He was telling me the story. They were having lunch with some other historian, and Michael Livingston said to this guy, who's like, you know that Mike wants to write a book about all these Greek battles, and he doesn't want to go to Greece to do it. And they're like, are you stupid? Like, you have to. Like, if you're going to write a book about, Thermopylae, you have to go to Thermopylae, right? Especially if you're writing nonfiction. So you have a responsibility to get that stuff right. So I actually think, like relax. Actually, it's easier making stuff up, or when you can make stuff up. There are parameters you have to fall within, but you can make up a magic lamp instead of using either torches or rushlights and ignore me completely. So, I think the basic thing is, if you do enough well, and if you do a couple things excellently, most readers will forgive you for the things you flub, right? So one way to sort of address this concern, right, is to find a couple of things that interest you, right, as a writer, and to do those extremely well. With Tolkien, it's language, right? George Martin has this criticism of Lord of the Rings where we're not talking about Gondor's tax code, which I completely don't understand. I think it's a completely silly critique of Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is actually silly, right? They use the Gregorian calendar in what is supposed to be like 8,000 BC, right? And there's like tobacco and tomatoes, and like none of that matters actually. But that's because everything else is so convincing, right? All of the etymologies and the names and the places feel real because of all of his work on that and his emphasis on that. One of the things that doesn't get talked about a lot with Patrick Rothfuss, for example, is his attention to detail with regard to coinage, right? That's a little detail, and if readers have a little concrete thing that is really, really well thought out and fleshed out and implemented, that will concretize things around it that aren't concrete at all, actually, because their brain will fill in a lot of the other details. This is true of things beyond world building. This is true of character motivations. This is true of plot. You can totally gap issues in plot as to like how someone knew to be X, Y, or Z if everything else sort of holds together. I'm not saying you should necessarily do that, but you can, under certain circumstances, gap things and not address them, right? A lot of new writers get sort of this kind of paralysis because they think they need to cover everything, and they feel like Paul Atreides locked in by his vision, unable to move, right? And so they don't write anything because they're like, whoa, actually, I can't write this book yet because I haven't figured out, what the denominations of coinage were in a country that I'm never going to visit in these books, right? And that's crazy. Like, don't do that, right? But readers are in a lot of ways smarter than I think a lot of writers want to give them credit for, right? They can understand stuff. You don't have to explain everything. You can trust them to fill in a lot of your gaps, and all you have to do is give them something to communicate that you've done the work, right? And that can be whatever you want it to be as the writer. I am not interested in coinage, and I'm certainly not interested in tax code. So you have to think about what that thing is for you, right? For me, it's one of the things is religion, right? I find that deeply interesting. I think that's more essential than tax codes, at least from a narrative perspective, unless your book is about taxes. But maybe it's castle construction, right? Maybe that's like super relevant to the story. And if you built a castle well enough, right, as like Tad Williams does, right, that it's really a character and in and of itself, then you can make the story, or like Mervyn Peake does, for example, right? Then the other things in the story that don't add up or close or make sense are things that readers will simply forgive because they're already there. They're already in the story. There's a pretty common email that I get now because I wrote Kingdoms of Death, where people email me and they say, "Why do you hate me? Why did you do this to me personally?" And my response, I don't think I've ever been brave enough to respond directly to an email and just say, "I don't think about you at all," right? Because that would be rude. But like, I don't actually think about my reader when I'm writing at all, because my reader for me is me. I'm still writing something I would want to read now and would have wanted to read when I was 15 and 18 and 25. And so I explain as much as I think I would want explained or need explained. And maybe that's just maybe depending on who you ask, I have a good instinct for this, or maybe I'm bad at it. It depends on the Goodreads review. I don't know, but I don't. But I don't think about the reader, and their direct experience that much. I think about the story, and since the story is in first person, I try very hard to think about how the character would tell it to his audience, but not to mine. And partly this is because I'm such a Gene Wolfe fan, right? And Gene Wolfe is much better at this than I am. At creating these first person documents that are really artifacts of their own worlds and not of ours. And if you do that, you don't really think about the 21st century person who's sitting there, because you need to be thinking about the 201st century person who's reading the story instead. And so that's not really a primary consideration for me at all, in part because I just trust the reader. And I think that so much of the conversation on this subject is about how we can communicate to the reader, as opposed to just sort of stepping back. Because to get back to the intent conversation, I hope I didn't come across as like an authorial intent supremacist at the beginning. I am an author, but like I do obviously have an intended reading of the text, and there are goals that I'm trying to accomplish. I'm always completely fascinated and baffled by people who I think are wrong when they start talking about my books. I'm like, oh, that's very strange. Like, what did you read? But in rhetoric, right, the onus for communication is on the communicator, right? And so if somebody gets something wrong, right, that's in my mind, that's because I didn't do something 100% perfectly, right? So if they're coming away with a different interpretation, I tend to blame me. But the reality is often that like some people are just so far removed from the me that I'm imagining as my reader that in terms of their beliefs, their cultural background, whatever, that they aren't going to get to my answer. And I think that's fine, because I think that I think that while authorial intent supremacists are not correct, I think that reader intent supremacists are completely wrong. If a work of art is only what you, the beholder, deem it to be, then all art is meaningless and everything is meaningless, and we should all just give up and die. Because there are no questions to answer, much less to ask. And an art is clearly, each work of art is clearly the product of its time and its place and its culture and its moment. And, but that isn't all it is, right? We can't read Shakespeare as an Elizabethan now. And so there's a lot of stuff that gets lost to us, right? I remember there's a pretty famous viral video about Elizabethan pronunciation experts reciting the prologue to Romeo and Juliet, and then the first scenes in the pronunciation of the day. And there were more puns than we thought there were, because we've lost that, because we don't speak that way anymore. The pronunciation of the word hour sounded like or, which sounded like Romeo was in fact pining away, not for hours and hours, but through whores and whores. For I forget the name of the girl before Juliet.
Well, you see that with the Great Vowel Shift too, and things like Sonnet 116, where the way that we say love now means that the poem doesn't actually rhyme anymore.
I lose my mind over this particular issue listening to hymns in church all the time. And you get this with regular songs too, where like clearly in this song, you're supposed to say again. You're not supposed to say again. Like, please, you're singing the song, do it correctly. I don't care how much they're paying you. Try it over again, right? But things get lost, right? Because we can't read necessarily historical works in their original context or in their original languages. I weep that I cannot read Dante actually. I can only read, like, I like Dante peeking in at paradise and hearing Beatrice's name, can only actually read the English version. And that sucks for me. And, you know, so there are things that are, you know, sort of lost, but that's true of readers who are reading contemporary works. Like there are people who just like don't get like I'm always baffled that like no one has caught or at least spoken to me about like all of the John Keatsisms that are like in random sentences in my books, right? They catch the Dune references, but
I
not the
catch
John
them all. I catch
Right.
them
Well,
all,
there's
my
you,
friend.
Jordan. You know, you are the panopticon, but you know, but it's but yeah, I don't worry so much about my readers' perspectives because I can't control them. Right. And so like they can be wrong. That's fine. You know, but you know, but I do think that the story that I think I'm writing matters, even if only in sort of a platonic sense. Right. And I think the way to evaluate if I've done a good job or not is how many people sort of get what I'm trying to do. Right. I think that T.S. Eliot thought that Hamlet was a failure dramatically, right? Because he didn't think that the point of Hamlet was very clear. I think if I remember the criticism correctly, something to that effect, right? But it was basically like he didn't think the play set out to do what Shakespeare was trying to accomplish, at least as far as he could tell. Right now, that's more of a forensic exercise. But with writers who say have YouTube channels and talk too much, like you can actually maybe figure out better what that intention was, right? Or if they have lots of letters, right? You can, if you're into literary studies, go and figure out what the book was trying to be and did they do a good job. Like I don't like Alan Moore, right? Because I don't like what Alan Moore is trying to say, but I like Watchmen because, you know, despite what he's trying to say, I think, you know, he actually told a pretty good story. It's not the story I think he set out to tell. Because he clearly doesn't like Rorschach, but Rorschach's like the only person who has any principles in the entire story. And he's willing to die for them, which is admirable. And yet he's confused that people like this character. It's never not baffling to me. So like he clearly didn't actually do, you know, the job he thought he was doing, but he did something cool. And now that's me as the reader, right? Applying my own interpretation to the story. But this whole sort of tug of war between reader and writer is never going to really be resolved. I just think the people who think it's just my feelings are out to lunch. So yeah, it gets easier, that's for sure. Even if
most
you're
definitely.
rewriting it 40 times, like you get a better sense of what you're doing just from practice. It's, you know, like we always talk about writing like it's magic, right? Like a lot of other writers are really, really bad about this, right? You know, they'll talk about the muses and like, you know, all the esoteric habits of famous writers. Like I have a special writing chair. I have a special writing house, right? I use a goose feather quill in my gazebo. Like this, all this does is raise the barrier to entry for like new writers, right? They think, I don't have a writing gazebo. I don't have a goose feather quill. I wouldn't know how to use one if I had one. You know, like I hate when writers do that. Writing is not magic, and neither are books, right? Like, writing is a trade. It is a craft. It can be honed. It can be practiced. You can improve at it, right? The same like as woodworking, as cookery, as anything. There's this sort of sense, and I think it's partly because we like fetishize like pantser writers who are like, oh, I just sit down and I like write my great horror novel. You know, like I outline like really, really meticulously. And so I have a reputation for maybe being like too much of a stickler, but like ultimately I know because it's done and like I have a feeling that it is ready, right? Like it's very much a like the targeting computer has been switched off. Like I feel good about it. I think you can get to that feeling a couple of ways, one of which is just like sheer exhaustion, right? That first time, like you're just sick of looking at it. You like, I'm like, okay, look, like I've been at this long enough. It's time to try. And I think you should trust your gut when that happens, right? And, you know, your gut is not actually thinking for you. It's part of your brain, and that's a different part of your brain, and it's telling you it's time. Trust that, right? But another thing you could do, maybe this will work, is that you don't know actually, but somebody else might. Maybe give the book to somebody else, or even better, if you have someone who's willing to listen, read the book out loud to them. And if you get through it without cringing, right, you feel pretty good about it, it's time, right? And you might be wrong. You might have really bad taste. But Your friend might have really bad taste, but the fact that you made it through it without cringing at your own work means that you're there, right? Good writing sounds good to your ears. Your ears also map to a different part of your brain, and it's not the part that did the writing. And so if you can read the book to, your siblings, your parents, your spouse, girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever friend who's willing to put up with your shit, and you don't even have to read all of it, right? You can look, can I read chapter 1 to you, right? Like, what do you think, right? Because they should be able to tell in that window, if they're not blowing smoke up your ass, if you've got something, right? You might not have it yet, but you're on the path of getting it, right? So I think that reading the book out loud to an audience and not like half-assing it under your breath to yourself can really communicate whether or not the text is ready in some form or other. Besides, reading out loud is fun. And if you're having fun, that's a really good sign. If you're reading out loud and like, this is good, you're there. No, there's no substitute for practice either, right? Like, the more you write, the more you figure out what your method is. And like you were saying, Brian, right? Like, there isn't a right way to do it. The right way to write a book is the way that results in your writing a book, right? Now, that could be as esoteric and weird as you need it to be. Like, if you have an extra house that you only do your writing in, right? If you're George Martin on his DOS computer, okay, man, like, if that method results in a book, cool, right? If you outline and that gets you to the book, great. If you don't outline and that gets you to the book, also great. I personally believe outlining is better, but that's just me. As long as it gets you where you're going and where you want to be, like, that's your method. And the more you figure out what your method is, the more you write, the more you figure out what your method is. There's really not a substitute for that, because you will get more assured as you go. Same with any skill, right? Like, you have to practice at it. Like, nobody is going to cook at a Michelin star level the first time they pick up a pan, right? Now, some people have like talent, will get them there faster, but you're never starting out at the top, right? Like, you gotta work on it. Doesn't matter what your talent is.
I think it does with like the early guys, right? I think there's an explicitly sort of like punk culture sort of anarchic left-wing bent to like Gibson and Sterling in particular.
Yeah.
The one Sterling story I have read is, I can't remember the title, but it's about an Islamic guy who's come to America and he's going to infect I think the future president, because they've like done some like computational analysis to figure out who that's going to be, with a virus, and they deliver this virus by having him snort cocaine through like a $1 million bill with Ronald Reagan's face on it, right? Like, it's like, I don't remember the title or anything except like that was the point of the story, right? Was that one symbol, right? And like, that's pretty clear. I do think there, at least early on, is this sort of sense, but this is why I was sort of laughing at how like even Neuromancer like stops being punk halfway through when we have to like save the artificial intelligence from the one faceless bureaucratic entity to give to the other one so that it can contact aliens. I want to know more about the aliens. Like, why did it never went that way? But I digress. But like, and Ghost of the Shell is about the police, like we said that earlier, right? And I was going to say earlier, right? Like, at this point, right? Like, now anybody who writes is like sort of appropriating the the aesthetic, right, and to a certain extent the ethics of that sort of 1980s cyberpunk stuff, which means they're all LARPers. To which I wanted to set up Orion's comment here. Ask a cyberpunk if they've ever bricked a cop car. They have not, right? Maybe in the 80s William Gibson did. I'm not sure. He got up to something, but I think those things were mostly drugs. But like everyone's sort of like to write cyberpunk now is largely to like go back in time, right? Mm-hmm. And it is not actually a forward-looking genre in a lot of ways. And I'm not dinging them for that, right? Fantasy is not forward-looking kind of at all, right? It's you don't have to be forward-looking. That's fine. But I do think that it is largely this is why I say a lot of science fiction, I think, is basically fantasy, is that it stopped trying to do what like the hard science fiction writers are trying to do when they write science fiction, what Gernsback was looking for, right, when he started his magazine. And that's like stories about cutting edge science and what the future might be like. Like, I don't think that is the point of cyberpunk at all anymore, right? I think that might have been what they were trying to drive at in their time and place, but like I think it's the fate of a lot of these movements and to become museum pieces. And I broadly think that cyberpunk, if it's not an aesthetic, right, when it's not just an aesthetic, is a museum piece. Because I think it's broadly addressing the like concerns of the Reagan era, which is 100 years ago. You know, well, you know, literally that one, right? Because we're sort of pushing these questions right now, right? You know, I mean, you know, Elon Musk got the whole Neuralink thing coming out, which is like a really bad idea. It's just a terrible idea. I have a lot of sympathy, you know, for people who, you know, need to use these sorts of things to like adjust for an injury, right? You know, but there's a lot of people who are just running around saying like, won't it be great when I could just get like rocket boosters strapped to my legs and I can get like robot claws and like Adam Jensen in Deus Ex, I can get sunglasses implanted in my face, right? Like maybe you won't, you know, develop some serious issues from having sunglasses implanted in your face. But like maybe, right, they'll short circuit and burn out your eyes, right?
That's Molly Millions, right? From Neuromancer.
Yeah, she's got the like full eye contact lenses that are like permanently attached. Yeah. But you can't touch them; they'll smudge, right? Like, how is that better exactly, right? Turns out I can just blink, Molly. You know, like maybe you have X-ray vision now or thermoptics or something, but like, guess they make goggles, right? You do not need to like permanently injure yourself to wear sunglasses, Adam Jensen. You know, they don't even look cool. Okay, like I don't know what they were thinking with that part of the Deus Ex 3 design. I just don't get it. But like, you know, but people are seriously considering doing all this stuff, right? I have a friend who was asked to give a talk at like a transhumanist society, which was funny because he's like the opposite of one, and they like, okay, you know, I'm deeply concerned by people thinking that we should be making these choices and, you know, performing, you know, purely optative, you know, surgeries on themselves and having these things plugged into their heads. Now I get it if you like can't form long-term memories and you like maybe need some sort, and like if there's a machine that can fix that, cool, right? But the avenues for abuse with regard to especially, right, you know, like neurological wetware is just so frightening, right? The government already is in your cell phone. Do you really want them in your head? Do you want Facebook in your head trying to sell you, I don't know, shoes in your dreams? Like, no, you don't want that.
Yeah, there's a novel about this called Feed by M.T. Anderson. That's what I mean. It's technically a young adult book, but that's what it's about.
Yeah,
it's about the fact that you have this essentially this Facebook, this Instagram, this Twitter scrolling in your head now. And again, it's got that kind of Ray Bradbury theme that it's not actually the government that does it. It's people that do it to themselves to try to keep up with each other. And,
sure,
you know, there are girls going to like parties and there's a new trend that suddenly flows into their internal feed. And so they actually go in to a bedroom and they will order like essentially Grubhub, DoorDash people will bring the new fashions to them like through the window as they're in the bedroom, and they will change into that so that they can be hip and trendy at the party when they walk out of the room.
Yeah, only in reality, the new hip trend will be, you know, kill yourself actually, because that is what Instagram is for. It is for causing teenage girls to kill themselves.
Well, that's what happens in the novel is that blisters become trendy. And girls start developing these blisters. It's like it's so prophetic. You can already see this. I can see stuff with. I won't give any details, but I can see stuff like this happening with my students already.
Sure.
These very trendy things that kids are doing to belong and to fit in that are really sort of irreversibly damaging to them.
Sure.
I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. No, But yeah, no, these are real concerns, right? And like when I was saying, you know, that cyberpunk is just a museum piece, right? It's not only that, right? Like I was speaking too strongly, you know, because obviously, right, you can update these things, but there are I only mean that like there are aspects of the genre that have this sort of museum quality to them. The Japanese is like that's like a pretty like pretty clear one. This is this whole sort of theme of genres or tropes becoming obsolete over time is something I've been thinking about a lot, because I've been watching a lot of the old Batman the Animated Series from the 90s, right? And like this is a bit of a tangent, but like Dick Grayson's origin story like is impossible now, right? Like there is not like you're not going to get a kid who like is 10 years old like being forced to go through the circus, right? Like like it just doesn't happen. Like there aren't circuses like really anymore, right? So like where exactly was Robin in the circus? Like it's an artifact of the past in a certain way. And like I like really the next Batman reboot really should be set in the 1930s, right? Like it should not be set now. Like he's sort of become part of he needs to be left in his time and place, and like continuing to update him has caused all these problems. Like he's gotten like so rich that like only Bruce Wayne could be Batman, right? And like now the story doesn't make sense, in a way that it might have made sense back in its time. And in the same way, like there are these elements of cyberpunk that I think like I mean new writers are shedding, right? Talking about Napper, picking the Chinese instead, right? But like that will also live its day and die, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there, this aesthetic like has to change and update itself, and there has to be a kernel, of relevancy that's beneath even the sort of aesthetic overlay, right?
Yeah.
Or you're only writing, retro future stuff.
Well, that's fun to read sometimes.
Oh, sure. Yeah. No, I mean, people love Fallout, right? To pick like a really like high profile example, right? But like nobody's, nobody's writing like ray gun, Buck Rogers stuff anymore. Although they should.
I get to LARP with you two, so that's kind of fun. You guys are like real authors, and I get to pretend that I'm one as well.
Yeah, there are no real authors. The real authors are all dead.
That's awesome.
Yeah, well, I think the escapism is a good place to start, right? Because I do think that the pressures of life can become so overwhelming in certain ways, and having a release valve somewhere else. I mean, this has been the function of drama all the way back, right? This is partly why the Greeks performed tragedies in the first place, right? We talked about catharsis and all of that. But there is a deeper function, right? Even to those ancient stories, and sometimes especially to those ancient stories, right? And for those ancient people, the stories had a deeper focus too, right? There is a religious element to story, even in our broadly post-religious sort of climate. There's a deeper meaning to our existence that we all know exists, even if we deny it to, practically speaking, in our day-to-day lives, or even by, there are people who say there's no meaning, but they sure don't act like it, right? And in fantasy and science fiction in particular, I think that sort of symbolic world can be concretized in a way that it's more symbolic in other stories. I think a lot about, I'm a big Thomas Harris fan, and I like Hannibal Lecter. And there is a dragon in Red Dragon, but it just doesn't literally breathe fire, right? So that's sort of more abstract, but it's better if the dragon, I think, is literal and is flying around and is burning down, thatch-proof cottages and the like. I think in fantasy especially, but in science fiction to an extent, because they're broadly the same thing, right? We sort of are able to touch on this symbolic level of our reality in a more literal way. And I think that is very, very valuable beyond the mere escapism, because we're escaping in a certain sense to a world that feels truer, I think, in certain ways. Their own life. Somehow a world of kings and knights and castles is more solid than a world of boardrooms and bank accounts, and so I think it's useful in that sense to find pieces of who we would like to be, if not who we are, in these other stories. I think that's maybe unfair to science fiction overall. Yeah. I do think. So I broadly agree with Jordan's bit of it, mapping new frontiers and stuff. You do see this in sort of the pulp phase and then into the early golden age of science fiction, right? Which follows after that. That's really, the golden age is really what people are thinking of when they say science fiction, and they strip out all the big properties, right? They're thinking of Asimov and Clarke and Heinlein. They're thinking of John W. Campbell. They're not thinking of, the pulp era is a lot weirder and a lot more experimental and open in a lot of ways. And so is what comes after with the new wave. But as you get into the new wave, right? Really, and I don't know if this is I think this is really an embodied thing. I think this is down to the authors themselves being different people, right? And the editors themselves being different people. Into the new wave, you start to see this mapping of interiority instead of interior spaces. And you see it's like Frank Herbert, right? Dune is not so much about Arrakis, really, as it is about the human sort of consciousness and will, right? And Paul's sort of strange powers and how that shapes his character and how his character then shapes the world, right? And you see this in, writers contemporary Herbert, you see it in Zelazny and Vance, and you see it in Le Guin. And there's a relationship between, the environment and the person, but science fiction does start to concern itself greatly with, like you were saying, what does the future look like for humanity, right? As organisms, as a species, as opposed to like what's out there, what can we conquer? Now that original thread, remains. You got writers like Larry Niven and Jerry Pournelle, who are, I think, in a lot of ways, a lot more simpatico with that sort of outward facing, let's say, expansionist streak in early science fiction. They're more simpatico with like Burroughs than they are with Herbert or Le Guin or something like that. But we've arrived at a point now where science fiction doesn't really exist. There are science fictions, and there are fantasies. They're all these little different competing schools. And so really all we're talking about now is a very broad umbrella in which we can, hold a lot of different ideas. And really about as many ideas as there are philosophies, right? Because there's all these little competing schools of what science fiction is or should be. And, if you look at the list of books that are up for the Hugo Award, it's quite different from the list of books that are up for the Dragon Award, right? Or is quite different than like what's getting listed for the Clark Award or whatever. And there's this sort of Tower of Babel effect that's happened to the industry just by virtue of its mass and charge. And so it's become a lot of different things. So there are more character driven science fiction pieces. But I think if you do look at the Golden Age, I think you're right. I think that like Isaac Asimov wouldn't know a character if it punched him in the face. It's just not the kind of writer that he is. Whereas, you're reading, fantasy period, it's going to be a lot more like that. But if you look at other writers that were around at the same time, 40s, 50s, you read C.L. Moore or Lee Brackett, like you'll find characters there. Like, but I fancy you could imagine yourself as Northwest Smith. Is based Indiana Jones. Like, why wouldn't you want to be? Right. So there are those characters. They're out there. But I don't think that impression of science fiction is what culturally dominated through the Golden Age, largely because I think John W. Campbell had such an outsized impact on the shaping of what the field was. I mean, he ran Astounding Game Analog for decades, and he ran it like very, very didactically. He wouldn't let Asimov put aliens in Foundation. Like that's a pretty like large editorial overreach from my perspective as an author, but he was like that controlling. And the result of that might be a lot of unhappy authors or variously happy authors. But it was to create an impression of science fiction as a thing, and it was his thing. Now there were competing camps even then, but that was so dominant the vision for so long that it's created this cultural sense that is what science fiction is. We still feel that way. Science fiction is still less widely read than fantasy because people have this impression that it's hard. And it's hard because Campbell wanted it to be technical. He wanted it to be
scientific fiction.
He wanted it to be scientific fiction, right? Although that was Gernsback's word, right?
Yes.
But Gernsback had this sense too, right? And this is another thing that this literature can do is educate you. And there's still this sense that like what, if you're a parent, right? My parents felt this way. That like really what your kid was getting out of reading these books was an education. And actually, there's a lot of nonsense in science fiction. And in fantasy too, of course, right? But that was how the product was sort of built. Two parents, right? Gernsback especially was trying to find anybody he could with letters after his name or her name, to fill out his magazine to increase the perceived value of his magazines to parents. So, but the story is written by a doctor, right? It didn't matter that it was a doctor of like entomology, and the story had nothing.
L. Ron Hubbard is a good example of what you're describing.
Yeah, well, yes, it's an example of a number of things. But but there's, but the point is there's always been a lot of variety within the field, and with regard to not just philosophical background or literary quality, but with regard to artistic intention. Some of those stories were purely written to entertain, right? There's not a lot in common between, say, Princess of Mars and iRobot. Those are quite different books. And to call them, the same thing is often, I think, misleading. But at the same time, too, we were talking, Jordan said something that made me think about somebody, I don't remember exactly, but I broadly think that science fiction is just fantasy for like a post-religious world, right? We find it a lot harder, find it a lot easier to believe in aliens than we do elves, or for that matter, angels. And so I think that science fiction broadly fills this sort of mythological gap for people who are skeptical of mythology and sort of Trojan horses that sort of need back into their hearts and minds. No, I broadly agree. Like I said, there are science fictions, right? So if you want to ask the question of where we are right now, I think the response to that is to ask, where exactly do you need, right? Because the thing that should be said about all of these sort of movements that Jordan sort of outlined, right, from political age and so on, is that we're talking not just about times and places, right? This is something I wanted to say too about the general appeal of stories as opposed to reading an academic treatise, right? Is that the ideas that those stories are about are incarnated in some way. And this is, once again, me bullying Parker as a hylomorphist to him, the Platonist, right? Like these ideas, like, they hit harder when there's an actual fist, right? And drama provides the fist, right? Character provides the incarnation, right, of these ideas, and places and settings and struggles, right, to play out these ideas, right? And this is true in the real world too. And with these different literary movements within science fiction, these epicycles within the greater cycle that is science fiction, right, as a whole, right? You're talking not just about abstract sort of disembodied things that are just happening of themselves. You're talking about people, right? We're talking about, like I said, John Campbell, right, driving the golden age basically single-handedly with his stable of authors, right, and leaving this huge sort of shadow in this impression. The new wave was new writers, and more than new writers, it was new editors, right? And same too as we get after that. And as the field gets bigger, because it's more lucrative, right, there are more editors, and so there are more author stables. And we're just talking about traditional houses at the moment, right? And then there are more authors to fill those stables because there are more editors. And those editors all have a vision. For example, now in fantasy, we're looking at a lot of crossover with romance at the moment. And this is broadly a consequence of the fact that that's what the editors who are buying fantasy right now want to do, because it's their personal taste. And always, there's always a sort of I am like big on elite theory, right? Like I think that these like highly placed people in the field, these editors, who have these jobs are picking to their taste because that's what they're hired to do, right? And so they're trying to advance a template of authors that are in their style and to their taste, and to make that taste for other people, right? And so the thing that's really changed in the last decade is not just the advent, the mainstreaming of independent publishing, right? People can just go on Amazon and they can put their own stuff up there, and if they can promote it themselves, they can bypass that whole mechanism, right? Now that requires a different sort of elite, a different set of skills. And the author has had to sort of reimagine him or herself as an entrepreneur in a way that wasn't true. Like Harlan Ellison could afford to be a jerk, right? Man, that's a really tough character to pull off these days. Like if you're trying to get people to say, buy your books through your YouTube channel, you can't just say, actually, everything is terrible and I hate everybody. And all these writers are losers. Right. And my readers also are terrible. You can't do that. You can't be Harlan Ellison. Darn. Right.
His stories are great though. You have to.
Oh, good. He's so good.
Brilliant.
Right. But he could never like hack it as a social media influencer, right? Selling his own books. It would never work. Right. He couldn't, that character can't exist anymore. Right. I'm only picking on him because he is he's a legend. Right. But like the circumstances have changed. So the character of the writers needs to be different, right? But the fact that indie publishing exists at all means that people who wouldn't be picked by any of the available editors, and there aren't that many. Publishers are small and there aren't that many of them, right? A big science fiction publisher might have 5 editors, right? A big one, right? Most of them have 1 or 2. And I'm talking about like the ones you've heard of. I'm talking about like Daw Books, right? My publisher, right? It's Michael Moorcock, that's Patrick Rothfuss, that's, Mercedes Lackey, CJ Cherry. Like these are like important writers in the last, 50 years, right? And they're, the product of, Donald Wollheim's vision, right? Betsy Wollheim's vision, Sheila Gilbert's vision, whoever the editor was at the time, right? And we are experiencing sort of a generational handoff in the editorial class right now. There are a lot of the old great editors are sort of backing out, right? And there's sort of like a little like Gen X bump, like kind of in the middle, but like most.
That's my next question. Yeah. With most of society, it's the boomers have held on forever, and the Gen X, I don't know, maybe it's their fault, but they got skipped over, and then it's millennials with not my kind of millennials usually who
Sure. And that's broadly the same process, right? It's going over to millennials now. And so there is a sort of cultural generational paradigmatic shift that's happening within the traditional houses that's just selecting for whatever the interests of those editors may be.
Yes.
Right now there is a big movement towards, let's say, questions of identity, which I find personally disinteresting. I'm not interested in the biographies of science fiction writers, myself included. My life is not that interesting. I want to know about ideas, so I'm not interested.
Are you not Hadrian? This whole time I thought.
I'm not even once. I don't even. I have a sword actually. That's a lie. I have several, but that's another video. But in any case, like that is sort of where the like mainline, the successors, if you will, of the Hugo versus Rome, right, are currently on questions of identity. The question really is whether or not that's still Rome or if Constantinople is Rome. And if Constantinople is Rome in this analogy, where is that, right? And there are a lot of other things going on, right?
Yeah.
Big sort of pulp revival movement on the indie side of things. Military science fiction, sort of the successors of Larry Niven and David Drake and Jerry Pournelle have almost all gone indie as well. There are a lot of small presses that are cropped up to create sort of their own little shared universes. There are all these like little tiny like really like author farm cultures where you'll get like a property that like one indie writer will create, right? And then he will raise up, or she will raise up 6 to 12 little writers to write more stories in the universe. They all sort of ape the Star Wars model, only it's much smaller, right? So you see a lot of that happening. That's really happening with things like space opera and military science fiction. In fantasy too, I had this conversation. I'm friends with Ryan Cahill, right? The traditional sort of epic fantasy has mostly gone over to the indie side of things as the traditional publishing has started selecting more for romance. And that was a very interesting conversation. And so everything is happening, right? It's just a question of in what form and in what place.
Yes.
Well, so as the traditional like empire of publishing is dying, it sounds like we should maybe have like set up like one place over here that only focuses on like the hard science, and then another one that focuses more on like the new wave and like the mind kind of stuff, and then eventually it'll grow back into a new empire in 1,000 years.
So I don't think that the traditional model is dying. A lot of indie writers like to say this, that they're like, oh, the big publishers are going away. Penguin Random House is not going anywhere, right? And they have a science fiction imprint, and those people's jobs are reasonably well protected by the big authors that they protect. Because the thing about publishers is they're fairly, they operate on fairly narrow margins, right? They don't make a lot of profit, but those profits are pretty guaranteed by their big hitters. If you're a science fiction publisher, approximately the size of something like Bain or Daw, you probably have 2 writers that account for more than half of your income. Period. Right. So you can imagine that's like Patrick Rothfuss and Ted Williams, right? Probably, this is an estimate on my part, I don't know Daw's numbers, account for the plurality of the Daw's income by themselves.
Yeah, it's just a law of nature. This is Pareto distribution.
It's right. It's a thing that's Pareto distributed, right? And so the thing is as long as those guys keep writing, right? Which is not always true, but as long as they keep writing, your checks are going to clear if you're a publisher. And so the rest of publishing is a gambling project. It's an experiment to see if you can replicate that sort of wild, unpredicted success in another writer. And it's something that's very, very hard to force because you need a lot of these different factors. You need the writer to be good, which is like not a guarantee, even if traditionally published writers, they might be terrible and the editor's taste might be off, right? You need the right cover, you need the right distribution, you need to hit the right time. You need there to not be any like hiccups on the back end. You don't need like the writer to, for example, write a bestseller and then come down with a nebulous disease that like prevents them from working ever again or from dying. Right. So like, it's very hard to replicate, a bestseller and to maintain a bestseller. Right. But if they're there and they're dependable, then you're fine. And you really only need a couple of them for the company to function. And so the rest of it, you can kind of afford to like, we're far enough into the podcast now to say to piss away the rest of your money. But they do that trying to find whatever the next thing is, and also like pursuing their passion projects, right? When David Hartwell was at tour, right, he was most of his stuff wasn't like big earners. Gene Wolfe is, to my mind, the greatest science fiction writer of all time, but he was never a New York Times bestseller ever, right? And so you do have just these writers that like they do okay, and you keep them around because they're good and because you feel it's important. And there's a certain sense of like noblesse oblige that these companies feel is their mission, right? To embetter the culture in some way by keeping these artists in circulation, even if they might not be taking a loss on them, although sometimes they do for a little while, or they gamble and lose. But they might be satisfied with like underperformance on certain parts of their catalog as long as they've got something to buttress. And so, less so obviously with indie stuff. If you're an indie guy and you aren't selling, then you have not quit your day job, and then you can't write as much, right? So, so there's never been more opportunity is another thing that like bears mentioning. If you like wants to be a writer and you're willing to work hard as possible at it, like you stand a better chance now than ever of being able to get started. But of course, then there's the signal issue. There's just so much stuff. Getting noticed is hard.
Do you think that in some sense the elites are failing readers?
Yes. No, I do. Obviously. Now this is, they're failing some readers. Other readers, they're doing the opposite of that, right? And I think the question is like, which readers are we talking about, right? And I think, for example, and I'm preface this by saying that there's nothing wrong with romance novels, right?
Of course not. Yeah.
But if you don't want to read romance novels, and the company that had been previously producing epic fantasy novels has ceased to produce epic fantasy and is instead producing hybrid epic fantasy romance novels, and you, for example, you don't like romance novels, then you have a problem because the company that you were buying from no longer makes the thing that you want to buy. They stop making sneakers. They only make loafers. And you hate those things. Right? Or whatever. Then you have a problem. And I do think that there are a lot of readers that the current crop of editors either don't want or don't think about. I think don't think about is probably more likely. I do largely think this is partly explanatory of my own success. There aren't a lot of 7-book series that are getting made right now because they're actually like very, very shaky financial propositions, particularly when the books are all 250,000 words long. I am a fool. However, there are a lot of readers who like one series of long books, and the options available, if that is the form factor that you like, regardless of the content, because there are people who are just like, I read long books, right? I'm like one of the only games in town at the moment, and that has had an outsized impact on my reputation, right? I also am writing science fantasy, right? I am writing a science fiction series that like basically has miracles and demons in it, right? And
laser swords, which is really important.
Swords. That's also like that is the thing, right?
Yeah.
And if you like that, like name 5 other. There it is.
For those watching here, I have Karn Cigar with his laser sword. Well, with Hadrian's laser sword. So
yeah.
There we go.
Oh, good. That's the book 2 cover for those who don't know. That's one of my that is I think everybody's favorite cover, but it's one of my
So good. Yeah.
It's so
Number one is my favorite cover.
Number one is also awesome.
It's very good too. I can't find any prints of that because it's different
It's
artists.
a different artist. Yeah. Sam will sell them, but you have to email him.
Oh, okay. I'll see
Yeah,
now.
he will sell them, but he doesn't have the little shop preset. Because Kieran did all my other art. We had a conversation. He's like, "Oh, I totally put the prints up, no problem." So he did. But
Yeah, number one's awesome.
yeah, well, no, they're all. I've been very fortunate in the cover department, but
I cut you off. You were on a
No,
great
no,
train of thought.
no, it's okay. But yeah, basically the point is that I think that I am serving an underserved demographic here in science fantasy fans. And there's obviously there's the elephant in the room here too, and talking about romance, right? And that is the demographic makeup of readership, right? Most readers are women, right? It's like between 2/3 and 3/4 of readers are women. Now in fantasy, that basically holds true. Science fiction, it's actually kind of the other way. Science fiction is a weird little bubble that's still mostly dudes. And so to the extent that the editors are, I think publishing is something like 85% women, in the houses, right? They are selecting for their tastes, right? And so they're forgetting about half of the human race, I think, broadly. Now that's not every editor, by no means, right? But the function of an editor, right, is to select their taste, right? And if you have a demographic that's not represented, right, in the editorial class, in this case, men, right, books for men, might not get printed, and men might leave to go read independently published stuff. I noticed that the big epic fantasy indie writers are all guys, almost all guys. There are obviously exceptions, right? But there are.
See, that's my point, Christopher, is that it runs both ways. In some sense, I blame men in some sense. They're part of the equation, which is, why don't men read? How come when I go to these backyard barbecues in the summer, I am the only person in the room who reads? And in some senses, the crisis of men dropping out of school, women earning the majority of master's degrees and PhDs and bachelor's degrees at this point, men just going in the opposite direction. So that's part of the equation, is men need to get their act together to some degree.
And read books, certainly, right? It's also video games are really good, man.
I have a poster in my classroom that says "Real men read," but on the other hand, there's some sense in which part of it is alienation. When you go into Barnes and Noble, and this guy who doesn't read too much stops by Barnes and Noble, he buys a coffee at Starbucks, and then he walks into the fantasy and sci-fi section. There's nothing that interests him,
right?
And that's a problem too.
This is a chicken and egg problem, right? There's right. It's both sides.
Well, I think it's great, obviously, right? Because it's helped make my career, more viable. Let's say I was doing okay before, we're doing, great now, thanks to all this. But I think it's important to delineate, right? Critics like Mike and like Daniel, right? Popular critics, right? And academic criticism, those are completely different things, right? And I think that largely the negative attitude of critics in the past is tied to the negative attitude that people have had about the academy generally, and not necessarily undeservedly, right? But the sort of literary enterprise of literary criticism, right? The academic enterprise of literary criticism, largely has been predicated on sort of deconstructing art, right, and taking a hatchet to it, and this is not all academic critics, right? But there is a sort of chip on the shoulder sort of thing that you can see in some of the people in the academy who are just they haven't built anything, so they tear stuff down. And I think normal people see that, and I don't think that's what people like Mike or Daniel are doing, right? I think that it's very clear that most booktubers love the books that they're reading, or they love books in general, right? They might not like a specific one, but they even love not loving certain books, right? And that it comes from a very sincere place, right? And that's super different than we need to really understand the role of Gothic literature in the 18th century and its cultural implication. It's a different enterprise, right? And academic criticism is super valuable, right?
Although 80% of humanities papers are never cited once.
Sure, there's a lot of really bad literary criticism that is mass produced, right, by the system currently. But Harold Bloom is very important, right? We do need to understand
the sort of collective cultural, machinery of literature and like how the great conversation has functioned over centuries. It's important to understand these things, and almost nobody has an understanding of that stuff, right? But like we need to know the story of us, right? Because literature in aggregate is a culture's collective sort of narrative memory, right? And if nobody's looking at that, right, academically, they should be, right? So it's important, but like of course, like people do it badly. It's hard. It was hard for me to get out of an English department without wanting to jump out of a window.
Right.
But the important thing with like popular criticism, right? I mean, you see this with film too, with like Siskel and Ebert, right? Is that it made talking about art, right, whether that's film or literature, right, a part of the whole process of engaging with the art in the first place, right? It makes the movies or the books last longer in people's minds. They have more to talk about. They're able to get deeper into this thing that they love. Like everybody likes movies, more or less, right? But if you have a vocabulary for how to talk about movies and to understand the process of a film's creation or something like that, or the relationship one film has to another or one filmmaker has to another, then you can understand these things that you love more, right? And people who just talk about the books that they love and why they love them, right, the films they love, etc., right, are ways to bring you sort of higher and deeper into, let's say, the mystery that is art, whether that's, books or film or comic books or whatever, music, right? They help give you this grammar, like on sort of a basic, and they also let you know what's out there because there's just way too much.
He who reads must choose. There's only so much time.
And
a big part of
it's worse now than it was then, right? Like there's more than 1 million books published a year. And you will not read most of them. It's not possible. This is something. I have a friend. I don't know if I mentioned him to you before. My friend Ben Yallow, he's an older guy. He's been going to World Cons since the 70s. He's the record holder for most consecutive World Cons attended.
Oh wow!
A wonderful, like Ben is just the nicest guy, right? But he has this sort of deep encyclopedic knowledge of science fiction literature, just as a moment in time, right? Not just as the individual books, but like how all these writers related to each other because he saw them all the time, right? Like he told me his first Worldcon, he got in a sort of a gentle argument with John W. Campbell because he'd written a letter to the editor and he remembered him, right? And he was like, "Listen, kid, you're coming with me." And then Campbell sat him down at the hotel bar and was talking to him about his letter, and Isaac Asimov walked up and like, so like the history was real for him, right? We have like lost a lot of that. And so and the other thing he said to me is that like when he was a kid he could read everything, right? In science fiction you could read all the pulp magazines, and like there were 4 or 5 publishers and you could read everything they put out in a year, right? So it was really possible for the Hugo to represent the whole field, right? In a way that it just isn't anymore, right? And like we don't have anything in common, right, in terms of what we're reading necessarily, because there's just a trillion books, and so having these critics help say, "Hey, I found this thing," right, is very helpful. Gives people something to read that isn't the same 4 things that everybody's reading, right? Because people do share at the top level, right? Like most fantasy fans read Martin, most fantasy fans read Rothfuss, Sanderson, etc., right? But there are a lot of other writers that they might not get to or have heard of, and people like yourself, like Mike, like help sort of broaden that field.
So that kind of raises the question of, there's been this long-standing debate in literary criticism, but also just in sort of our intellectual life in the Western world for a very long time, which is, what is the purpose of reading? And you have someone, even a proponent of the great books programs like Robert Maynard Hutchins, who said the purpose of a liberal arts education is to liberate students. And this is a very controversial claim, I think. He says from their race, from their background, from their political whatever, from their nation, even from any tribe that they're a part of, the purpose of reading literature is to liberate people from the sort of arbitrary characteristics that they're sort of born into, and it is to give them this broader experience. And then you have people that say the purpose of a liberal arts education is to teach people how to be free, or the purpose of a liberal arts education is to teach people about their own culture.
is to actually enculturate them, meaning, and I get into this debate all the time in my department, which is I will defend certain books and people will say, why do we need to read this book versus this other book that I want to read? Isn't it arbitrary that you're advocating for Paradise Lost and Homer's Odyssey and Plato's Republic? And my argument is, it is deeply important for us to know ourselves. It's important for us to understand the norms, the practices, the traditions, the customs that have been handed down to us and where they come from, so that we can better know ourselves and so that we know what we have, in a kind of Chesterton's fence sort of way, which is, let's know what we have before we go tearing down that fence. And I just think that it's important to like understand the roots of what is it Tolkien says, deep roots are not reached by the frost. Like I think that's deeply important. What do you think is the purpose of reading?
Well, you're going to get no real argument from me there, right? Of those three options, right? I tend towards that third one, right?
Yeah.
The reason that we teach children books, right, is to bring them into our culture, right? Now, that's difficult, right? Whose culture, right? This is the question. This is the problem we have in our school system, right? Because there are a lot of different cultures, you know, in one place, right? And that's really hard, right? Because you have to account for that.
Yeah.
And and you should also like read outside of your culture. There are reasons to do that because
world literature course.
It's a big and beautiful world, and there are amazing books that are not part of sort of any individual or any particular tradition. There's something everywhere, right?
Yeah.
But the reason that you have an English literature education is to ground someone in a culture. That is what we made it for.
Right.
That was what its original function was. And to a certain extent, I find that it's broadly. It's really hard, right? So let me back up for a second, right? Because I, obviously I've spoken to a lot of like high school students, right? People who read my books, and I remember being a high school student, right? It's not too long ago, and mostly people didn't know why we were in English class. Why do we have to read all these old dead books? They suck, right? They have nothing to do with anything, right? And you always get these like sort of nebulous, sort of vague answers about how really what you're doing in English class is learning how to learn, these books are helping you to learn, to write or about the history or something. Those are all like maybe,
or it's a puzzle, or Shakespeare is difficult because it's early modern Elizabethan English, and the whole thing is about critical thinking.
Or worse, you get no answer at all, right? It's like you are reading Shakespeare because it was on the curriculum, and we're teaching the curriculum
because he invented so many words, and don't you see how important it is to the language that you speak?
Right, or they try to do something silly and say like it's really actually it's like very hip and happening, and like we'll make it
Shakespeare. And
like the thing is like actually
he was so ahead of his time.
Like that's also true.
It is true,
right? Like there's no reason Macbeth should be a hard sell to high school students. It's actually awesome, right? There's a murder,
Hamlet or Othello,
right? There's a murder. There's a conspiracy. There are witches. It's great. Also, Macbeth is his shortest play. It's like it's totally the one
shortest tragedy, right?
It's the shortest play.
Shortest play period.
Yeah. So like it's an easy sell. Like Macbeth is
I got a great quote for you here. This is, you guys can take this home. Whenever you go to your friend's house and you want to compliment your friend's house, you say this: "This castle hath a pleasant seat. The air nimbly and sweetly recommends itself unto our gentle senses." That's King Duncan as he's riding up to
be murdered.
To be murdered.
Yes.
Come on, that's good. That's what you said. I mean, your friend's going to be like, "What the hell's wrong with you?
What is wrong with you?
Smoking?"
Oh, for me, they'd expect it. I think they'd probably expect it from you too. But no, this is what it's for, right? But then the greater issue that sort of arises from this, right, or the related issue, right, is like, why do you learn to write, right? Because the other options you gave us aren't completely wrong, right? Like, why are the arts liberal? Exactly. It's not because of how they vote, right? That's not what it means, right? Of learning to write is learning to think, right? And that does liberate you from something. It liberates you from you, right? It liberates you from your own viciousness, your own stupidity, right? Your own, frankly, like your own sin, right? Your own faults, right? That's why we learn. That's why we cultivate virtue, right? Is to not be ruled by our vices, right? To be
not become a slave
to be Aristotelian here, right? Or I am a Catholic, right? Like this is why we started with grammar, logic, rhetoric, right? That was the classic educational model, right? That's the trivium, right? And when you learn to write, you learn to think, right? Because you learn what you think, and you can learn what you think by reading what other people think, and you can like their ideas, and you can not like their ideas, right? But you practice writing, right? And you read to practice writing so that you can become yourself, right? That's the real reason. And we've like completely lost any sense of that. We don't tell children that what you're actually learning, right, is to think, right? Not how to learn, but how to be yourself in the first place. Because you have to start out by like telling people what to think in the sense of like what's out there to think about, right? So you have to start with a sort of core set of documents so that people know, like, you know, you live in a culture, right, that like we've got, you know, it starts here with Homer, it starts here with, frankly, the Bible, right? Like, this is also a big problem, is that like the cornerstone of Western literature is the Bible, and we don't teach that, right? By and large. And it, like, how do you teach Dante or Milton, right, without teaching scripture? It's basically impossible. It's also pointless, right? So we have this big problem there. But no, you learn to read so that you can learn to write and so that you can learn to think, right? Because otherwise you become some kind of Manchurian candidate, right? Because there's an episode in the Korean War, right? The Chinese would make American POWs write essays critical of America, and they came home critical of America because they wrote an essay about it, right? And if you are made to write from a certain perspective, right, and you're not sharp enough to know the game, right, then you will come away thinking whatever they told you to think.
Well, so that's a really interesting question, because I think I think I actually was given a copy of it when I was like 12, and I never read it. I hate being assigned reading by my friends. I'm very bad about getting around to stuff. My old roommate is on my case trying to send me more comic books to read, because he's like, you liked Berserk. I finally made you read it after, 10 years or however long it was of trying, and you loved it. So why don't you listen to me? And so I just ignored that copy, the Orb Books copy of Shadow and Claw, for years. I think I actually got rid of it. And so I ended up buying another copy around I think it was my senior year in college, because it was after I had written the original draft of what became Empire of Silence, the first Sun Eater book.
That makes sense.
And so I was trying to find an agent, and I decided it was finally time. I was not intimidated by it. It has a reputation for being very difficult, which is something I think I want to get to before we really get into it. But I just didn't know that I was going to like it. It's about a torturer. I tend not to, at the time, I wasn't really interested in stuff that was like that kind of dark. Obviously, as I've gotten a little bit older.
You thought it would be grimdark.
Tended in that, yeah, I did. I thought it would be really nihilistic and bleak and kind of unpleasant to read, right? In a way that like Steve Donaldson is unpleasant sometimes, and most of the time. And that's not a dig on Donaldson, right? Like, that's what he's trying to be, right? And so I held off, and I read it in my last semester in college. I was already interning at Bain Books, right? I was already kind of part of the industry, and I was just utterly blown away, right? I usually am not. I usually don't like things, and so to discover something that really, for me, like, instantly jumps to the top of my list, right? The only book I enjoy more than this is Lord of the Rings. It is almost a dead heat, right? But they are very different, so I refuse to call a winner in that fight, right? And so I was also disturbed in reading it, because I was glad that I hadn't read it sooner, because I would have abandoned trying to write the Sun Eater entirely. I already had people like to point out the similarities between my work and Book of the New Sun, and that was almost a swerve in the revision process, because I knew already that people would think I'd read it, and so I needed to kind of just own it. I already was using obscure Greek and Latin words like peltast and and anagnost and dalater and all of these things. Yeah. But I ended up sort of deciding that I wanted to be Gene Wolfe when I grew up, because he is, as all of the quotes you started at the top with say, he's the very best that I think the science fiction genre has had in the English language, at the very least, and maybe period. Since science fiction is so associated with the English language, with English literature. Not to say there aren't, other language contributions, but he just totally staggered me. I've since read it. I think this is my 5th or 6th time. I'm not 100% sure. because it's just really good. And I have a habit of rereading Lord of the Rings and Dune, and I added this into the rotation. So this year, and I don't read very quickly. So this year, all I've read is Lord of the Rings, and now I'm reading this. And I made a vow not to read Dune again until The Sun Eater was done. So I'm not going to reread that. But I am sort of hitting my greatest hits at the moment. And since you wanted me to do this, I just finished Call of the Conciliator today again, so I am slightly ahead of you because I think you just finished like a couple hours before this, right?
Yes.
So it was this morning for me, but it was and it still holds up. As with Lord of the Rings, it's one of those books that you can kind of get more out of more or less indefinitely, right? I'm to the point where like random lines of Hobbit dialogue make me choke up, right? They're on their way back to the Shire and they're like, oh, it's it'd be nice to get home, and I'm like, it's not gonna be though. In the same way, right? Like I have a different sort of I find different things as I reread this, and that is why I'm not so worried about the spoiler talk, because the reason I think that people are worried about spoilers is that, like lemons, most books only have one squeeze in them. And that isn't true of really, really good books. Yes. And so if you learn, in the same way that if you learn the M. Night Shyamalan twist, right, there's no point in watching the movie because that's kind of all he has to offer. Most books, if you know the ending, you've read the book already, right? Because it's a question of getting to that ending. With Wolfe, that's not true. There's so much going on. This is, I think, the most like hyperlinked book that I've ever read, right? Every single line in the book connects to other parts of the series. There's not a single like wasted clause, right? The prose is so perfect, right? And it is like very stylized and very dense, but it has no fat on it at all, right? This is like A5 Wagyu text, right? Although Wagyu is actually really fatty, but you know what I mean, right? It's really high grade, perfect writing, and because of that, you can continue to get stuff out of it. It's so nutritious, right? That being spoiled, right, isn't a big deal. Severian, our hero here, literally spoils the ending, right, in the first chapter, right? And there's even more stuff, that's forecast literally in those first couple paragraphs that doesn't really become clear until maybe your second reading of the final book, right? It's that dense, and so to spoil it, as I say, isn't a big deal. But in talking about this too, this is the other preface thing I kind of want to get out of the way. The series has a reputation for being very difficult, right? It's sort of up there with Malazan, right? It's probably harder than Malazan, if for different reasons. I have not read all of Malazan, but I hear people who have both think this one edges it out. In any case, I don't think that reputation is fair. I don't think that this is a very difficult series to read. I think it is a very difficult series in a sense to master.
To understand.
But you can read it casually, and it might not be your favorite book, but you can read it and have this cool science fantasy sword and sorcery adventure through this weird Earth that's got robots and a giant and tortures and executions and laser fights and grave robbing and all sort of cannibalism, right? And all of this crazy messed up stuff. And a main character who is a real piece of work, right? And have a good time, right? And there's even more weird stuff that you haven't gotten to, because books 3 and 4 are 10 times weirder than the first 2, right? And so you can totally read it just for that and be like, I'm not sure I got even 30% of this, but like there were some cool moments and I feel smarter because there were some really cool scenes that resonated with me. You can take those with you, right, out into the unpastured dark, and to borrow or to riff on a phrase. And if you catch one of the deeper things, right, maybe you'll realize like, oh, this story was a pun about Theseus and Master's theses, right? And that's funny, right? Then you'll feel smart too. He is the thing about really clever writers, right? And I don't know if I am one, and I'm not fishing, right, either, right? Is that they make you feel smarter, right? And I think Gene Wolfe is really, really good at that, right? He doesn't put his readers down, he kind of lifts them up with him. And so while the books may fight you, they are puzzles for you to solve and realities for you to experience, to riff on Dune, right? And so don't let its reputation stop you. The series is amazing. It is as for as much of a reputation, being a Dune fan as I have, this book is, as a work of literature, 100 times superior. And I cannot, I cannot praise Gene Wolfe enough as a craftsman, as a storyteller, as a thinker. These books are unmissable as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, well, those are all a lot of, there's a lot there, right? So the first thing, as far as the initial kernel, my understanding is, and I'm not a biographer of Wolfe's by any means, but my understanding is that the kernel of the story was that he wanted to write about a young man going to war, which was part of his own experience, right? Wolfe was a Korean War vet. One of, at the time, a very small number of science fiction writers who'd actually seen action. Like David Drake was one. There are a couple others, but I know that Wolfe and Drake both had a strong, sort of relationship based on the fact that they were both vets. Drake was in Vietnam, and so there's actually something that Wolfe wrote about in a David Drake anthology that I helped publish when I worked at Baen Books. He wrote a little bit of an essay about the kinship he felt with Dave on account of their shared military experience. And so I think it is not precisely a biographical novel, right? But in sort of a sideways kind of way, it's drawing from a lot of his own personal experiences. When you get into the actual war sections in Citadel, right? They really, feel like, these are the reflections of a guy who was actually there. Right, he talks about the sort of thing that a writer like me might leave out, right? Like the fact that a lot of war is just waiting around in boredom, punctuated by 10 seconds of absolute terror, right? It has that feel to it, and so I think just capturing that sort of that ethos, right, is the like romance of going to war clashes with the reality, was sort of the seed of the original project. Now, I have never read the just the novella version that this grew out of, and I know it's called The Feast of Holy Catherine, and so this is probably a gap in my education, but I think it just deals with the initiation stuff at the beginning, right? Because at the beginning of Shadow of the Torturer, there are all of these moments where Severian is sort of stating or asking, is this the point at which I've become a man, right? And he talks about the soldiers receiving a coin and that being the symbol of their transformation. To borrow, is that a Jung novel, Symbols and Transformations? Not novel.
It might be Man and His Symbols.
Yeah,
I think that's another one.
But it's about those symbols of transformation, right? The coin, his habit as a guildsman, the sword itself. And so it's really a story about those changes, right? And about growing up. And about, sort of generational renewal as sort of symbolized through the whole cosmic cycle, right? Because that's the thing, right? Is that Wolfe is, he's a Catholic, right? To speak about the traditions he's coming out of, this is a big part of it. And this sort of sense, right, that there is a sort of a pattern that is carried out on the cosmic scale that is repeated, to borrow a Ptolemaic term, in epicycles, right, in the lives of each of us individually, right? We're all supposed to imitate the life of Christ, right, the life of God. And he says Severian isn't Christ precisely, but he's a Christian figure, and he's a Christian figure in this sense, right? He is imitating, the action of God, right, in a very literal way in the text, right, by bringing about a new creation on earth, right? And so that's part of that tradition, and that all ties back into this sort of central theme about growing up and about going to war. So it's playing, on this very personal human level, all the way up to the cosmic at the same time. And that's really, I think, what the story is about. As far as the other seed where he got the idea from, he's pretty on the nose about it. It was reading Jack Vance, right? It was reading Dying Earth. He wanted to do his own take on it, and he brought in a lot of his own more sort of literary bent, right? Not that Vance isn't necessarily literary, right? He's certainly, kind of in the middle of the spectrum if you had to really stack up science fiction writers. But, I'm not trying to denigrate Vance in any way. Vance is a genius.
No,
but
pulpy meets literary, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, he's sort of right down the middle in a way that Wolfe's way out on the literary end, and someone like maybe Fritz Leiber is sort of towards the pulpier end of the spectrum.
I wonder where Christopher Ruocchio is. Where would you say he straddles that line?
I want to be kind of in the middle personally. I might skew a little towards the literary. But I kind of want to be in the middle. But yeah, so Vance was really the thing. And I don't know what about the Dying Earth sort of subgenre spoke to Wolfe precisely and said, this is the thing that I'm going to do next, right? This is going to be my magnum opus. I don't even know if he knew this was going to be the one thing that like people really, pinned to his name, right? When he set out, because I mean, who does, right? Could have been the Wizard Knight for all he knew, right? Maybe. Although the fact that he went back and did 2 more series in this, maybe that in this universe, maybe that some indication they had an idea. In any case, yeah. So as far as the traditions, right? Talked about the religion, but there's also in terms of style, he's a postmodernist, right? Right, which is usually for me a 4-letter word, right? Because like all the postmodern philosophers are just evil, demonic, jerks. But that's another conversation.
Well, another reason it's hard, Christopher, is that I agree with you, and I think you're right about that. And I share your skepticism of postmodernists who themselves have skepticism for everything. But what I would say is, I do sometimes, and you'll probably agree with this, I sometimes think it's hard to draw the line precisely because you'll have people who call, Samuel Beckett and James Joyce modernists, and you'll call then later novelists and later critics and theorists postmodernists. And so I guess I would say that he kind of straddles a line between modernism and postmodernism. But in sci-fi is usually it's known for being kind of straight to the point and clear, and you're going to be able to understand these ideas and you're going to be able to get through it. And it's got its origins in, Victorian sci-fi and then the pulps. So I'm thinking that when you read someone like Wolfe, you're tempted to say it's super postmodern. And it does have those qualities, right? The non-linearity and the playing with time and how fragmented it is, and all of the little nuances and the way that it doesn't hold your hand and the way that it's kind of disjointed and all of that. But at the same time, yeah, I don't know. It also felt a little bit like reading one of those early 20th century modernist novels in some ways as well. Someone like James Joyce.
Absolutely. Right. And because you're right, it's really impossible to draw hard lines between genres. This is one of my bugbears, right? And even separating science fiction and fantasy is, to my mind, pointless unless you're trying to sell a book to somebody, right? The only reason to explain, is this cyberpunk, is this gothic horror, is it, whatever, right? Cosmic horror, right? And where those lines are is if you're trying to sell the book to somebody. Really every book, because what people in science fiction mean by genre, right? And we talked about this, I think, on my channel, is a collection of like tropes and things, right? Almost nobody in science fiction fantasy spaces think about style very much. They're just like, I like that sentence. That sentence was nice, right? Which is like totally fine, but they're not thinking about what tradition of, literary style is this book in. But he is a postmodernist, right? In at least the fact that we all are. Right. And this is what I think is so great about Wolfe, because ethically he has nothing in common with, Derrida, Foucault, or even
Catholicism doesn't mix well with postmodernism in a lot of ways.
Right. Or anyway, really. Right. But he recognizes that like he is writing post-modernity, right, in any case, right? The Somme has already happened, right? World War I is over, World War II is over, right? Like it's the future, deal with it. And so he's writing in the sort of literary sort of it style of this period, right? But with a sort of ethical core that is much older than that, and sort of transcends time in a certain sense, at least so I would say, being a Catholic myself, right? And so he's able to kind of get the best of both worlds. One of the things that's so interesting about being in like Gene Wolfe fan groups on Facebook, right, is there are a lot of people who really love the books and who love Wolfe who are really hostile to Wolfe's worldview. And you see this with Tolkien too, right? And that's so interesting. And I think it's because either people aren't thinking that closely, or I think it's because people might even engage with both Tolkien and Wolfe on an aesthetic level before they think about anything. And I think in a certain sense, aesthetics are more powerful than ethics, right? And so I think that simply, right, we've been real academic for the last 10 minutes, but like simply off the back of the fact that this is a science fantasy adventure series about a former torturer, right, who becomes the emperor of the world by eating the brain of his predecessor and gaining all the memories of all of the former emperors, while also fighting a bunch of Cthulhu creatures that live in the ocean that are controlling a nation of potentially clone communists, right, to try and conquer the earth. Like, that's awesome, right? And just on the back of how cool that is, right, just purely on like a rock and roll level, right, I think people can get into this book in the same way that like Lord of the Rings is awesome because it's about a bunch of dudes trying to destroy a magical bit of jewelry, right, with the odds stacked against them. They have to cross the entire world to get there. That's cool, right? That's just cool on the face of it. You don't like think about where the author is coming from until you're like well invested in, like, oh gosh, he just like mercy killed this lady who was his prisoner and his girlfriend, right? And now she's a part of him, and what the hell is going on, right? And that's one of the things that's so great about literature, period, right? Is that because it's narrative and because it's aesthetic, it can kind of knock over basically any fence, right? You could be like a Shinto, right, and like love Lord of the Rings, right? You don't have to be a Catholic to like it, right? You don't have to be a Catholic to like this. You don't have to be anything to like anything. Like, a story is a story, and if it changes you in some way, and good stories do, right, then that's great, right? This is why like I don't do polemics, right? Like, a story is so much cooler, and at minimum it's more fun, right? And so I want to reiterate, I guess, sort of up front, we're a little bit in now, that like all the talk about Book of the New Sun is about how like dense it is and about how amazing and complicated, and that scares a lot of people, and it really, really shouldn't, because Wolfe he's writing for smart readers, but that's because he knows you're smart, right? It's not because he thinks you have to be, right? He trusts you to like puzzle out enough for you to have a good time, but he's not trying to like be condescending, right? He's not trying to write a book that's up its own ass for the sake of doing so, right? There's just a lot there because he wants you to like get your money's worth, basically, right? And that's what separates him from, I won't name names, but like other writers, right, who like really are writing books to be self-impressed or self-impressive. That's not the game here, right? This is just trying to be the best book that it can be. And because it's Gene Wolfe, it's a really good book, right? So that's sort of my opening statement.
But it was pretty different. She just sent it directly to people that she knew, which is like how you're supposed to do it. Yeah. But there really seems to be a generational divide. This is true of editors too. Things are changing in ways that I don't understand. And I sometimes feel like I got on the train like right as it was leaving the station, and like they were demolishing the station behind me. It sort of, it feels like that sometimes. Because I got in like in the like most sort of like stereotypical like Stephen King typewriter way. Right. I sent query letters out cold with like literally nothing in my bio at all. I had a college professor who once taught at one of the Clarion workshops for science fiction. Yeah. And so I mentioned that I like studied under a former Clarion professor, but like I stuck the word Clarion into my query letter.
Hey, that shines like a beacon.
that was what did it, right? But I was like totally faking it, right? Because I didn't go. I didn't pay up to go to Clarion at all. Although that is a thing you could do. There are like writers camps and workshops like this that are known to agents and that do have a shine to them that helps your name poke out in submissions, but that's like not necessary, or at least it's theoretically not necessary. These days the way to do it seems to be is to go to literary conventions and like physically speak to agents and then email them later, and that
personal touch that helps.
Yeah, and that has a COVID. Yeah, because there's so much of the process too is like to coin a phrase is shit testing, right? There's a certain element of like trying to make sure that people aren't crazy, because we would get like the strangest submissions, because I was on the other side of this too. Right. I would be in the office and like see the slush pile, and people would bribe us, or writers would do weird things like send their submissions in crayon or something because they thought it would make them stick out, or
you know, I heard stories how like back in the day they used to receive let's say candid photographs from.
Are you serious?
From certain people, but this was decades ago. I did not see any of these. But it's a mess, right? I know that Bain would go through 120 submissions a month, and of those, like maybe one or two would get waived on, and you know, it's difficult to go in that way. So the agents theoretically are a screening process, but of course many of them are, as you found out, are not the best. But yeah. So then you like went independent after that. You said,
well,